Hey guys, tonight we're travelling back, way back to the 13th century, where your dreams of higher learning have finally come true. You've made it to one of the most prestigious medieval universities in Europe, likely Paris or Bologna, maybe Oxford if you're feeling rainy and rebellious. You've got ambition, a bag full of scribbled parchment and possibly lice. No one warned you that student life here is less Ivy League and more try not to starve or get stabbed. You're not a modern student with a dorm key and a library card. Nope. You're a young man, because yeah, you probably are, more on that issue later, arriving in a cold, stone-clad city full of narrow, winding streets that smell like horses, wood smoke, and people who don't know what soap is yet. Your clothes are simple, maybe a second-hand cloak, some rough woolen hose, and boots if you're lucky. You don't stand out yet. You will. For now, you're just another hopeful scholar drifting into the medieval academic maelstrom. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your city and what time it is for you right now in the comments. I want to see how far this bedtime rabbit hole reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's early morning, and you're stepping through the thick wooden gates of Paris. The year is 1250, and the streets are already bustling with carts, dogs, shouting merchants and beggars. The city feels alive, but overwhelming. You've arrived to study theology, or maybe law or medicine, but no one really cares why you're here. You're just another one of hundreds of students flooding into the university every year, looking for knowledge, or status, or both. The University of Paris isn't a single campus. It's a loose cluster of colleges, lecture halls and religious institutions spread across the left bank, and calling them colleges might be generous. They're more like ramshackle boarding houses attached to church buildings, run by monks who are equal parts academic and disciplinarian. The heart of the school is the Sorbonne, founded just a few decades ago. It's tiny by modern standards, but it's buzzing with big ideas and even bigger egos. You're nervous, understandably. You're far from home, likely broke, and trying to blend in with seasoned scholars who speak Latin, like it's their first language. Most of them do not suffer fools gladly, but still there's a quiet thrill pulsing in your chest. You're here. This is real. You've made it to one of the most intellectually intense and spiritually fraught environments in the Western world. But first things first, you need to find a place to sleep. The streets are loud, and nightfall brings thieves and worse. You pass by a few university colleges, their stone walls streaked with soot, students peeking out from iron-grilled windows. Some have painted symbols above their doors, often religious. You're drawn to one named after St. Nicholas, the patron saint of scholars. Seems promising. You push through the wooden door and inside it's dim, dusty and faintly sour smelling. A narrow hallway leads to a cramped common room where a few students are reading aloud to one another by candlelight. You're greeted by a frazzled-looking man in a patched robe. He's a procurator, basically the guy who manages the place, and he eyes you like a man judging whether a chicken is worth plucking. You explain, in your best Latin, that you've come to study. You show him the tiny stash of coins you've somehow held onto despite being shaken down by guards at the city gate. He shrugs, decides that's enough for at least a week's lodging, and tells you to follow him up the creaky staircase. Your room is an experience. There's a narrow wooden cot stuffed with straw, a rough blanket, and a single shuttered window that doesn't close properly. You get a chamber pot, yay, and a basin to wash in, though there's no water. You'll have to fetch that from a well out back. You collapse onto the cot, exhausted from travel, your feet sore, your stomach growling. You're here. You're actually here. And yet, you already kind of miss your mum's soup and a bed that doesn't smell like mildew still. There's no time to mope. Tomorrow, you have to officially register as a student. By the way, here's something most people forget. Medieval universities weren't just schools. They were ecclesiastical institutions. That means you weren't just becoming a student. You were technically joining the clergy. You had to pledge yourself not just to study, but to the church. No, you weren't necessarily training to become a priest, but the system didn't really separate religious life from academic life. Everything you learn is seen through a spiritual lens, even astronomy and medicine, especially those. Here's a quirky fact for you. Medieval students had legal immunity from local law. If you committed a crime, you couldn't be tried by the city authorities. You were judged by church courts. This created no shortage of chaos, as students often exploited their privileged status to drink, gamble, or brawl with impunity. The locals hated this, and the tension between town and gown was very real. But more on that later. Now, about this whole university thing. There's a scholarly debate over when exactly the first true university was founded. Was it Bologna in the late 11th century, Paris in the early 12th, Oxford soon after? Scholars still argue about whether these early institutions were actual universities or simply evolved cathedral schools. It depends on how you define university, as a corporation of scholars, a formalised curriculum, or just a bunch of nerds yelling in Latin. But for you, the details don't matter. You're here. You've crossed forests, dodged bandits, maybe sold off a family goat or two to get here, and tomorrow you take your first real steps into this strange, exhilarating, and occasionally terrifying world of medieval academia. You're not ready, no one is, but you've made it this far. Get some sleep. You'll need it. The sun hasn't even broken over the rooftops yet when the bell tolls from the nearby chapel, dragging you from a sleep that was more like a battle against straw poking you in odd places. Your back is sore, your blanket barely covered your feet, and someone was singing drunkenly in the hallway until well past midnight. Welcome to student housing. It's your first official day as a university scholar, and before you even think about books or lectures, you need to figure out where and how you'll actually live. Right now, your home is a 10-foot square room that smells faintly of onions, smoke, and something more mysterious. Hopefully not rats. Downstairs, the common room is already buzzing. Some students are hunched over texts, mumbling Latin under their breath. Others are arguing, loudly, about some philosophical point involving Aristotle, and whether God can make a stone so heavy he can't lift it. You sneak past them and head for the street. Today's mission: find a more permanent place to live. Because what you've got now is technically lodging, but it's more like a storage closet with delusions of grandeur. Your first stop is a neighbourhood near the Rue de Foix, Straw Street, named charmingly after the bundles of straw students would sit on during lectures. This part of Paris is where many of the teaching masters hold classes, and it's also lined with houses for rent, taverns that double as boarding halls, and overly enthusiastic landlords eager to fleece naive students. That includes you. You check out a few rooms. One has a window, but it also has a hole in the roof. Another offers a shared bed. Yes, bed, singular, with two other students, one of whom snored audibly while awake. Another option is a cramped garret above a butcher shop where the smell of meat permeates everything, including your dreams. Still, that one has a chamber pot and a view of the alley, which counts as luxury in your current bracket. You quickly learn that medieval housing isn't about comfort, it's about survival. You need 4 things: a roof, some kind of locking door, good luck, proximity to a water source, and neighbours who won't rob you. If you get 3 out of 4, you're winning. Eventually you land on a room in a house owned by a widow named Agnes, who rents to students to keep her household afloat. The rent is high, of course it is, but she offers meals twice a week and doesn't seem like the type to rifle through your things. The room is tiny, with a crooked wooden shelf and a straw mattress on the floor, but it's yours. More importantly, you won't be fighting drunken theology. Students for space in the privy every night. Speaking of privies, let's talk about sanitation. There isn't much. The streets of Paris serve as a kind of shared bathroom/trash bin. People toss waste out of windows with a shout of "Garde à l'eau," watch out for the water, which is your only warning before human sewage comes raining down. That's not poetic metaphor. That's just your new daily risk. Your room does not include bathing facilities, obviously. Baths, if they happen at all, are rare and done at public bathhouses. Gender segregated, sometimes morally questionable, and occasionally shut down by the church for encouraging vice. For now, you'll rely on a cloth, a basin, and some extremely strong incense. But the biggest hurdle in your new lodgings? Heat. There isn't any. Paris in winter is bone-chilling, and you'll quickly learn to sleep in your full cloak, hat, and maybe even your boots. If you can get your hands on a brazier, a small metal basin for burning coals, you'll feel rich. Until you realise the room fills with smoke, and you start coughing like a 90-year-old monk. So it's a trade-off: warmth or lungs. Still, for all the discomfort, there's a growing sense that you're carving out a space for yourself. You unpack what little you have: a small sack of wax tablets, a stylus, a sheaf of parchment sheets, maybe a borrowed psalter or a Latin grammar if you're lucky. Books, remember, are painfully expensive, so unless you copy one yourself, more on that later, you rely on lectures and shared texts. You organise your things neatly. You sit cross-legged on your straw mattress. You breathe. A bit of quirky trivia for you. Some university rooms were officially inspected to make sure students weren't hiding anything immoral, like dice, cards, or girls. Of course, they often were. Not that you'd know anything about that. But the point is, even your living space was subject to surveillance and regulation, usually by the college head or a local cleric tasked with keeping the student population more studious than scandalous. Results varied. Meanwhile, scholars continue to debate what constituted student housing in the early medieval university. Was it formally managed, like in some colleges, or just ad hoc private arrangements with locals like Agnes? The truth is, it was both. Some universities had affiliated dormitories or cloisters, others left students to fend for themselves, leading to situations where 4 guys crammed into a storage loft and took turns using a shared grammar text as both a pillow and a Latin dictionary. The line between college and squat could get very blurry. Later that afternoon you return to the Rue du Foire and see the crowds forming. Students are gathering for what looks like an outdoor disputation, or maybe just an argument that got out of hand. One tall fellow in scholar's robes is standing on a crate, passionately gesturing with a piece of parchment in hand. A second student is shouting back, his words rapid-fire Latin. You catch phrases like Summa Theologica and Blasphemia Manifesta. The crowd is loving it. This is normal here. Loud public debate is the academic currency. Forget essays or online discussion boards. If you want to be respected, you learn to argue, eloquently, loudly, and with references to obscure Roman philosophers no one else has actually read. It's not just about being right, it's about sounding right, preferably in front of an audience. As you watch, someone taps your shoulder. It's another student, maybe a year ahead of you, with ink-stained fingers and a welcoming smile. He asks if you've found a place yet. You nod. He grins and says, "Good, that's the hardest part done. Now you just have to survive the rest." You laugh, a little nervously, because the way he says it, he might not be joking. You return to your room that night with a small loaf of bread and a bit of cheese, both hard enough to injure someone. You eat slowly, thoughtfully, staring out your crooked window at the city flickering in candlelight and moon glow. Somewhere out there are other students, huddled in similar rooms, maybe feeling just as overwhelmed, just as excited, just as utterly out of place. But for now, you've got shelter, you've got bread, and tomorrow, the real madness begins. Morning again, and this time you wake with something new, purpose. Today's the day you officially enroll as a student at the university. No pressure or anything, just the formal entry into one of the most influential intellectual institutions of the medieval world. Easy. Except, well, the process is about as straightforward as trying to copy an illuminated manuscript with a candle blowing out every 5 minutes. Registration isn't exactly a click here to enroll situation. It's more like a multi-step scavenger hunt through the offices of various clerics, each more suspicious of you than the last. You start with a journey to the nations. These are administrative student bodies divided loosely by geographic origin. Think of them like medieval Hogwarts houses, but with fewer wands and more grumbling in Latin. There's the French nation, the Norman nation, the English nation, if you're at Paris, and several others depending on the university. You find the one that aligns with your homeland. After all, you're not just a student here, you're also representing your entire region, whether you like it or not. To register, you need to swear an oath, and not a simple, "I promise not to cheat on my homework" kind of oath. No, you're swearing to uphold the statutes of the university, to obey your masters, and to conduct yourself in a manner befitting a cleric. Yes, cleric. Remember, by enrolling, you're automatically considered part of the clergy, even if you have no intention of ever stepping behind a pulpit. This clerical status gives you a number of perks, including tax exemptions and the aforementioned legal immunity. but it also means your life is expected to follow a certain moral and intellectual path. Whether you stick to that path is another story. The ceremony is held in a modest hall filled with other nervous-looking students clutching whatever Latin they've managed to memorize. A Dominican friar, robed, solemn, and already annoyed, recites the necessary prayers and legal phrases. One by one, you and the others step forward to sign your names in the Book of Scholars. Or rather, you mark your name with a shaky hand, trying to remember the exact spelling and hoping the ink doesn't blot too much. Quills are not forgiving. Once your name is in the book, you receive a token, usually a small wax seal or a parchment proving your status. This is your academic passport, your student ID, and sometimes your only defence against guards, landlords, or irate townsfolk. Guard it with your life, because losing it means starting this whole bureaucratic dance over again, and you'd rather eat your own boots. But wait, before you run off to class, there's more paperwork. You need to be matriculated, which means your name must also be recorded by the university's central authority, often a chancellor or rector. This individual is rarely available, always busy, and absolutely drowning in scrolls and correspondence. After a couple hours of waiting in a freezing hallway, and listening to a scribe drone on about the errors in last year's tax rolls, you're finally ushered into a cramped chamber where the Chancellor himself, a gaunt, squinting man with ink-stained hands, asks you 3 questions: your name and place of origin, your intended course of study, whether or not you are possessed by demons. Okay, the last one's implied, not asked outright, but he looks at you like he's wondering. You mumble out your responses and he waves a tired hand, signalling your acceptance. That's it. You're officially a student. You should feel triumphant. Instead, you feel like collapsing. Here's a fun historical tidbit. Some students, especially those from wealthier families, hired proxies to register on their behalf, essentially outsourcing the process while they lounged at inns drinking spiced wine. These stand-ins were often older students or clerks familiar with the system and willing to go through the bureaucratic motions for a price. You, however, are not wealthy. You're very much here in person, sore-footed and underfed. As the day winds down, you head to a nearby tavern, the safer kind that caters to students and not travelling mercenaries. You're hoping for a small celebration, maybe a hot meal if you're lucky. Inside, it's dim but warm. The scent of roasting onions and ale thicken the air. Several other newly registered students are already gathered, swapping stories about their registration disasters. One got lost for hours and accidentally wandered into a private lecture on advanced logic. Another was nearly arrested for mocking the bishop when he sneezed during a religious procession. You laugh with them, a little lighter now, a little more at home. One of the older students raises his mug and offers a toast in Latin, something about the eternal light of knowledge and the never-ending darkness of ignorance. You clink mugs and drink deeply. It's warm, vaguely sweet, and probably watered down, but it tastes like accomplishment. Here's a quirky fact to ponder while you sip. Medieval universities often required students to be unmarried. The idea was that marriage would distract you from your studies and interfere with your commitment to scholarly life. Of course, this didn't stop anyone from pursuing extracurricular activities, but officially you were expected to be celibate, obedient, and humble. Unofficially, well, some students were known to keep lovers, attend brothels, or even marry in secret. The enforcement of celibacy varied depending on the college and the local church's tolerance for scandal. Scholars still debate whether this mix of academic rigour and religious control helped or hindered intellectual growth. Some argue it allowed for structured development of ideas and preserved knowledge during chaotic times. Others say it stifled innovation, forcing thinkers to walk the tightrope between inquiry and heresy. You, personally, are just wondering if you'll get kicked out for asking the wrong question about original sin. As you walk home that night, you realise something's changed. The streets are still noisy, the air still smells of ash and something you're not brave enough to identify, but you feel like you belong just a little. You pass other students in their dark cloaks, murmuring Latin phrases or humming quietly to themselves. The city is still a maze, but now you've got a map, of sorts, and your name is on the roll. You're one of them now. Back in your tiny room, you light a stub of a candle and press your wax seal into the corner of a blank parchment. No reason, really. Just practice. Just proof to yourself that you're here, that this is real. You've enrolled. You've joined a tradition that stretches across centuries, and though your bed is lumpy and your dinner was mostly crust, you've taken the first step into a world of intellect, discipline, and more than a little madness. You blow out the candle. Tomorrow, your first lecture. Hope you like Latin. The bells wake you before the sun does. Again. You'd think you'd be used to it by now, but somehow the sound always hits your skull like someone ringing a church tower from inside your head. It's not even a proper melody, just a flat metallic clong. Clong. Clong from the chapel tower that signals the start of prayers, and also your first lecture. You grope for your cloak, which somehow wound up in a heap on the floor. The air is freezing, the kind of cold that makes your breath visible and your joints ache before you've even stood up. You throw your cloak around your shoulders and pull your boots on over socks that feel more like damp burlap sacks than anything warming. No time for breakfast. Besides, you're still slightly haunted by last night's cheese. It tasted like it had opinions. Outside, the street is wet and sticky with mud. The sky's the colour of old parchment, low and heavy. You join a stream of other students, hooded, muttering, occasionally yawning so wide you can hear their jaws crack. You're all headed the same way, toward the College of Arts, where your first real lecture is about to begin. But don't get ahead of yourself. Orientation isn't some friendly meet and greet. There's no welcome week with free tote bags and awkward icebreakers. No one's handing out syllabi or directing you to the nearest coffee shop. Instead, you're learning the ropes in the most medieval way possible, by being confused, tired, and mildly afraid. The students around you aren't exactly giving off friendly vibes. Some are deep in conversation, in Latin of course, while others are staring straight ahead like condemned men. You arrive at a building that could generously be called uncomfortable. It's a stone hall with wooden benches crammed into rows, no back support, no cushions, and a draft you could lose a monk in. You find a seat near the middle and sit down on what might as well be a rock. You try to look like you belong, but you're pretty sure your face is doing the opposite of that. Enter the Magister, your first master. He strides in wearing a black robe that swishes dramatically behind him, and a skullcap that looks like it hasn't been washed since the last crusade. His expression is somewhere between bored and judgmental, and you can tell immediately this man has no patience for fools, lateness, or poorly declined verbs. He clears his throat, then begins, not with welcome, not with let's begin. No, he simply starts reading, in Latin, fast. This is the lecture, and let's be clear, he is not teaching in the way you're used to. He is reciting, word for word, from memory, sometimes from a book, but mostly from his own mind. The text is likely Aristotle, or maybe Boethius, depending on what part of the curriculum he's grinding through today. He doesn't pause, he doesn't explain. He just goes, like a medieval audiobook set to 1.5 speed. Your job? To write. Frantically. If you can afford parchment, you're scribbling as fast as your cramped hand will let you. If not, you're using a wax tablet and stylus, hoping you'll remember enough to transcribe it later. Some students don't even try to take notes. They just sit, eyes wide, mouths slightly open, trying to absorb what they can like cold, hungry sponges. Here's your historical fact of the night. Lectures at medieval universities were usually lectio, that is, straight readings of texts. The master would recite a passage and occasionally offer brief commentary called glossa, but detailed explanation, discussion, not happening yet. That's reserved for something called a disputation, which is its own beast entirely. Still, there's something oddly hypnotic about the rhythm of it all. The Latin drones on, but underneath the droning there's a pattern, a structure. Ideas unfold logically, with premises and conclusions tied together like a monk's laces. You recognise a phrase here, a concept there. You don't understand everything. Honestly, you barely understand anything, but you catch just enough to keep swimming. The master pauses. Not for your benefit, he's just annoyed that someone in the back sneezed too loud. He resumes without acknowledgement, but you notice several students have subtly taken this moment to shake out their hands and rotate their sore shoulders. You're not alone in your suffering. Oh, and let's not forget the seating arrangement. Students sit on stone or wooden benches called scholae, while the master has a high chair, often on a small platform. It's symbolic. He's closer to heaven, you're closer to back pain. The hierarchy is baked right into the furniture. A quirky fact for you, the word chair comes from this exact setup. The cathedra, the chair of the teacher, symbolised authority. Even today we say someone holds a chair in a department. It all goes back to this very medieval seating drama. And speaking of drama, one student near the front just dropped his ink pot. It rolls across the floor and leaves a graceful black streak before clattering to a stop. No one moves, no one laughs. Everyone stares ahead like nothing happened. You suspect the master would excommunicate a student for giggling. The lecture grinds on, after what feels like 3 years, but was probably just under 2 hours. The master closes his book, mutters a prayer in Latin, and exits with the same dramatic swish of his robe. Students rise slowly, creaking like old furniture. You don't realise how numb your legs are until you try to walk. Someone next to you mumbles a string of curses in perfectly conjugated Latin. The hallway outside is flooded with bodies. The scent of ink, wool, and anxiety lingers in the air. You overhear someone asking if they can borrow a glossed copy of today's text. Another is boasting that he understood at least 2 whole sentences. You're somewhere in between, dazed, but quietly proud that you made it through without crying or running away. Here's the ongoing scholarly debate. Were medieval lectures designed to actually teach, or were they just a ritualised performance of knowledge? Some historians argue that the structure favoured memorisation over true understanding, especially since books were rare and reading outside of lectures was difficult. Others say the very difficulty of the format forced students to develop mental discipline and rhetorical skills that shaped the future of Western education. Either way, you're going to need more ink. That night you sit in your freezing room, your notes in front of you, smudged, incomplete but real. You try to review them by candlelight, muttering phrases under your breath until they stick. It's slow going, you're tired, your hand aches. But somewhere in that pile of Latin, there's a spark of understanding. You made it through your first lecture. You're officially part of this strange academic brotherhood now, crawling through the dark, ink-stained tunnels of medieval learning. You survived. Sort of. Tomorrow? Logic class. Which is ironic because nothing about this life feels even remotely logical. The next morning arrives with a groan. Not from you, though you're close, but from the wooden beams above your bed creaking under the weight of pigeons having what sounds like a heated theological debate. You bury your face in your cloak, but it's no use. Your back is stiff, your fingers are still stained with yesterday's ink, and your brain feels like it's been wrung out and hung over a smoky fire. But duty calls, and today it's logic. One of the cornerstones of your early studies at the university, whether you like it or not. You stumble through the morning fog to the lecture hall. It's the same cold chamber as yesterday, only now you're on to the next circle of academic purgatory. A few students look more awake than usual. These are the eager ones who either didn't sleep or have already committed most of Aristotle's Organon to memory. You find your bench and settle in, trying to suppress the creeping dread that this subject might just break your brain in half. Your magister today is shorter, older, and slightly less terrifying than yesterday's, with eyes that dart around the room like a sparrow looking for the exit. He opens with a phrase you'll come to both love and loathe: Logica est ars artium, scientia scientiarum. Logic is the art of arts, the science of sciences. Fancy, right? Basically, it's the foundation of all rational thought. If you can't argue well, you can't think well. And if you can't think well, good luck not getting destroyed in your theology disputation later. He begins again in Latin. Always Latin. This time, though, there's a kind of rhythm to it that makes more sense. He's not just reciting, he's demonstrating, using syllogisms, drawing them out with gestures in the air like invisible equations. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, he waits. A few students mumble the answer. Socrates is mortal. He nods, as if you've just discovered fire. It's one of the few moments of interaction you'll get. Welcome to the world of scholasticism, a medieval method of learning that's part logic puzzle, part theological chess match. Everything is about disputations, formal debates that test your ability to argue a point using both scripture and reason. In fact, logic is the required first, Step in your journey to any subject. Want to study theology? Better know your syllogisms. Thinking of tackling medicine? Better be able to prove your conclusions with precision. Logic is the gatekeeper. Here's your historical fact. Logic wasn't just academic. It was a powerful tool in medieval society. Church councils, court cases, and even royal decrees often used logical forms to argue truth or guilt. The structure was comforting. Premises, conclusions, clarity and chaos. Logic was seen as a way to mirror the divine order of the universe. God, after all, didn't do anything randomly. But here's a more bizarre twist. Logic also drove some students and scholars off the rails. There are recorded cases of scholars arguing absurdities just to test the boundaries of logic, like, can a person be in two places at once? Or, if a man is sitting and then stands, where did the sitting go? These weren't just academic play. Some believed these questions unlocked divine mysteries. Others just liked to win arguments. Today's lecture wins through terms like modus ponens and modus tollens, contrapositive and fallacia. Your quill scratches furiously across the parchment. You feel the soreness in your wrist, the little panic that sets in when you miss a sentence and know you'll never reconstruct it later. Still, something clicks. For a fleeting moment, you understand the structure is like lifting the veil on how people think, why they believe what they believe, and how they argue their way into or out of trouble. Of course, not everyone's handling it so well. One student across from you slumps forward, snoring lightly into his copy of Porphyry's Isagoge. Another is picking at a scab with such focus it might be his only strategy for surviving the hour. You catch yourself zoning out once or twice, thinking about food or warmth, or whether your ink stains will ever come out of your only tunic. But you snap back in time to catch a discussion of the famous liar paradox. If I say I am lying, am I telling the truth? The master lets that hang in the air like incense smoke. You swear one student actually winces. Here's your quirky fact. Medieval students were sometimes so obsessed with logic that they applied it to everything, even social interactions. There's a story, possibly exaggerated but too good to ignore, about a scholar who attempted to seduce a tavern maid using a syllogism. Spoiler, it didn't work. But he did apparently get slapped with perfect rhetorical structure. By midday, the lecture ends. You stretch your arms and roll your shoulders, which are still hunched from hours of note-taking. Outside, students gather in small circles, arguing over the master's points. Some get so heated you half expect someone to pull out a dagger and shout, "I'll duel you on the square of opposition!" But most of it stays verbal, mostly. Here's where things get interesting. Logic lectures are one thing, but the real trial comes in the form of a disputatio. These are scheduled debates, sometimes formal, sometimes impromptu, where a student or group presents a thesis, and the rest try to dismantle it. You'll be expected to participate soon. Not today, thank goodness, but soon. And here's the thing. These debates can get brutal, personal, petty, sometimes even physical. If you offend the wrong student, or worse, challenge the authority of a master, you could find yourself on the receiving end of a public embarrassment that will haunt your academic career, or at least your next bathhouse conversation. There's a long-standing scholarly debate about how effective this style of education really was. Some argue that it was too abstract, too caught up in hair-splitting and hypothetical nonsense. Others see it as the birth of critical thinking, the foundation for the Enlightenment, and the intellectual scaffolding of the modern world. But for you, right now, it's mostly just exhausting. That evening you attend a voluntary disputation held by upper-level students. It's held in a converted chapel lit by torches, and filled with the murmuring of anxious robed figures. The challenger stands, clears his throat and delivers his thesis. Whether angels can occupy the same space simultaneously. The room hushes, and then it begins. One by one, students rise to challenge him, using every trick in the logical book to poke holes in his argument. Some quote Aristotle, others invoke Augustine. A few just ask increasingly ridiculous questions until someone laughs and ruins the solemn mood. You watch in awe, and, okay, a little fear. These students are fast, ruthless, polished, and they do it all in Latin, which adds a level of academic theatre that makes your head spin. But deep down, something stirs. You want to do this? Maybe not today, maybe not next week, but someday. You walk home with your head full of syllogisms and hypotheticals. Your breath fogs in the cold air. Your fingers are sore, your boots are damp, and you're dangerously close to developing a passion for logic. This is who you are now, a scholar, a student of order, reason, and, if you're lucky, truth. You fall asleep that night dreaming of disputations and paradoxes, your wax tablet tucked under your straw pillow like a talisman. Because tomorrow the arguments begin for real, and you'd better be ready. It's a few days later, and you're already beginning to understand something important. You're never going to own a book. Not really. Not in the way you imagined. Before you arrived, you probably pictured a quiet library, a shelf lined with dusty tomes you could pull down at will, sit under a window with, maybe sip something warm while you turn the pages. That fantasy has been absolutely shattered. Medieval books are not just expensive, they're the medieval version of a private yacht. If you see someone with more than one, they're either incredibly wealthy, part of a monastic order, or a thief with extremely poor long-term planning. You get your first glimpse of a proper academic text today when you follow a group of students into a side room of one of the colleges. It's dark, lit only by 2 flickering lanterns hung from iron hooks, and it smells like wax, vellum, and a hint of mildew that never quite goes away. In the centre of the room is what looks like a small cage. A rotating wooden book wheel, really. But the prize inside is a single, fat manuscript chained to the desk. Yes, chained. Like a prisoner. This is the university's copy of the Sentences by Peter Lombard, a key text in theology, and the bane of every poor scholar's existence. It's written in meticulous Latin script, the letters sharp and angular, with marginal glosses so dense they look like spiderwebs spun by an overachiever. You don't touch it. You don't even think about touching it. A senior student stands nearby, watching everyone like a hawk wearing academic robes. Here's your historical fact. Chained books were standard at medieval universities and cathedrals. These manuscripts took months, sometimes years, to copy by hand, often by monastic scribes. The cost was staggering, not just for the materials like vellum and ink, but for the labour. One book could cost the equivalent of a small house. So to prevent theft, they were literally locked down, often in special reading rooms called scriptoria or studia publica. If you wanted to read, you had to stand there and do it, on site, under watchful eyes. Some students, if they were desperate or clever, would copy passages into their own notebooks. That's your goal today. You wait your turn, approach the chained text with reverence, and begin copying by candlelight onto your parchment scrap, writing as quickly as your fingers will allow. You're not even sure what half of it means, but that's not the point. Having the text in any form is better than nothing. Of course, there are other books floating around, lecture notes passed from student to student, fragments of older works, cheap pamphlets with poorly translated Aristotle, but actual bound codices? Not happening. And if you dream of owning your own textbook, the closest you'll get is buying a partial copy off another student who's either graduating or desperate for food. This leads to a curious little microeconomy among the students. Some make a living copying books by hand for others. It's tedious, slow, and brutal on the eyes, but if you have a steady hand and decent Latin, it pays. Barely. You meet one such student today in the courtyard of your college. He's squinting at a borrowed manuscript, scratching out lines with obsessive focus. His fingertips are permanently stained black, and he mumbles phrases under his breath as he works. You ask him if it's worth it, and he shrugs. Better than begging, he says, then sneezes violently into a rag and keeps writing. Here's your quirky fact. In some cases, the margins of medieval manuscripts are filled with strange doodles. Snails battling knights, cats playing harps, monks mooning demons. Some scholars think these were made by bored copyists. Others believe they carried symbolic meaning. But more likely, they were the medieval equivalent of, "This lecture is boring, I'm going to draw a dragon eating a bishop." Not all texts are in Latin, but most of the important ones are. Vernacular texts, French, English, Italian, are emerging, but the university still sees Latin as the language of real knowledge. Which is why your days are now filled with terms like substance, accidents, univocity, and form and matter. They're not just abstract ideas, they're tools you need to read and argue and survive. This is where the real panic sets in. Because even if you survive the lectures and take decent notes, you still need access to the texts. Without them, you can't prepare for disputations. You can't respond to master's questions. You can't pass your exams. And if you can't pass your exams, then, well, you'll go home with nothing but ink stains and a reputation for failure. This is why some students band together into study groups, pooling notes and sharing what little parchment they have. Tonight you're invited to one such group, held in the drafty attic above a baker's shop. 6 students huddle around a single candle, passing around a partial copy of Aristotle's Metaphysics like it's holy relic. One reads aloud while the others debate the meanings of each line, occasionally breaking into arguments about how to pronounce certain words, or whether the Latin translator was drunk. Probably yes. You listen, scribble, try to absorb as much as you can. No one here is a genius, but they're determined, and that's what counts. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how much access students truly had to books in the medieval university. Some argue that while copies were rare, they were widely shared through public readings and oral tradition. Others claim that the scarcity of books limited intellectual freedom and forced students into rote learning. Either way, your reality is simple. If you don't copy it, you don't have it. And if you don't have it, you're in trouble. Back in your room that night, you lay your notes carefully on the shelf above your mattress. They're uneven, filled with gaps, smudged where your candle dripped. But they're yours. You wrote them. You bled for them, almost literally given the number of times you jabbed yourself with the quill. As you blow out your candle, you wonder if anyone will ever read what you've written. If centuries from now, some scholar might find your notebook and puzzle over your Latin, your odd spelling, your hurried sketches of logic diagrams and monks with swords. Probably not, but the thought makes you smile. You fall asleep with ink on your hands and Aristotle in your head, surrounded by words you don't yet fully understand but already love. It's your second week now and your backside officially hates you. The stone benches in the lecture hall, somehow both freezing and razor-edged, have done unspeakable things to your tailbone. You've taken to folding your cloak twice and sitting on it like a makeshift cushion, but even that's starting to feel like sitting on bundled sticks. Welcome to the medieval lecture experience, part classroom, part medieval torture device. And yet, here you are again, just like every other groggy-eyed scholar dragging themselves in for another 6-hour marathon of academic suffering. Today's lecture is on natural philosophy, which basically means science, though no one calls it that yet. It's taught by a gaunt master with a voice that could lull an angry bear into hibernation. He opens with a reading from Aristotle's Physics, which is ironic considering nothing about your body feels physically okay. You brace yourself. You know the routine. Sit, listens, try not to freeze, and try even harder to not fall asleep. Because if you do, there's a non-zero chance of waking up with an inkwell dumped on your head as a punishment/public service announcement. The master doesn't waste time. He drones through the Latin, stopping every few lines to explain some technical term or clarify a passage that's been debated for the past 200 years. If someone sneezes, no one says bless you. If someone coughs, no one cares. The only sound, aside from the droning voice of the master, is the constant, desperate scratching of quills. Today's topic is the concept of motion. What it is, how it works, and why. According to Aristotle, things don't move unless they're moved. This is mind-melting stuff. You're not just talking about physical movement, like a rock rolling downhill. You're talking about the why of motion, the deeper causes, the prime mover, the eternal thing that set all other things into motion without itself being moved. It's a lot to think about before you've had anything to eat. Here's your historical fact. In medieval universities, natural philosophy covered everything from physics to cosmology to biology. It was the foundation of the sciences, but tightly bound by theology. You couldn't propose a natural theory that contradicted church doctrine, or if you did, you had to phrase it very, very carefully. Saying, for example, that the Earth moves around the sun would get you laughed at best, and accused of heresy at worst. Copernicus and Galileo wouldn't show up to ruin everything for another few centuries. Still, some of the masters pushed the boundaries. One of them, Master Gilles, has a reputation for whispering things like, the moon might affect tides, and maybe plants have some kind of inner principle of growth, which is the medieval version of suggesting aliens built the pyramids. He's careful not to publish these ideas, but he shares them with students he trusts. And if you're lucky, You might hear something whispered between lectures that doesn't come straight from a 900-year-old text. Now, here's a fun, fringe fact. Some students try to liven up lectures by passing notes. Not with words, but with crude drawings, usually of the master doing something unspeakable to a donkey. There's even a rumour of a book floating around filled entirely with anonymous student doodles, passed hand to hand like some kind of underground zine. One guy swears he saw a marginal illustration of Aristotle in a tutu wrestling Aquinas. You're not sure if he's serious, but honestly you'd pay to see that manuscript. But back to the grind. As the lecture wears on, the air in the room gets staler, heavier. Someone near the back opens a window, letting in a brief gust of cold wind and horse stench from the street. It's not pleasant, but it keeps you awake. You shift your position on the bench and glance at the student next to you. He's scribbling furiously, tongue poking out of the corner of his mouth, ink splattered across his knuckles like battle wounds. You feel a strange camaraderie in that. All of you are here, suffering together, chasing the same unreachable thing. Knowledge, yes, but also maybe some weird academic bragging rights. There's a brief break after 3 hours, which you celebrate by stumbling outside and blinking against the pale daylight like some scholarly cave creature. A few students wander toward the bakery for dry bread. Others huddle around a brazier someone's managed to light without burning down the college. You join them, rubbing your hands together and making awkward small talk in Latin. "Did you catch the bit about the unmoved mover?" one student asks. "Only the part where I think I stopped moving myself," you reply to polite chuckles. The break doesn't last. You're herded back into the lecture hall for another session, this time on celestial spheres. You learn about the firmament, the crystalline heavens, the perfect circular motion of planets. It all sounds very orderly, very divine. No one knows yet that elliptical orbits will one day blow this whole tidy cosmology to bits. But for now, this is sacred science, predictable, hierarchical, and full of Latin names for things no one can see. Here's the scholarly debate of the day. Were these lectures really meant to educate, or were they just a form of mental discipline, like lifting weights with your brain? Some argue that the lectures were too rigid, too inaccessible, and basically just a memory game. Others say they trained the mind to see patterns, make connections, and think deeply, even if the content was sometimes miles removed from real life. Honestly, after 5 hours of hearing about metaphysical substances, you're inclined to believe both sides. By the end of the day, you're wrecked. Your ink is nearly gone, your cloak smells like candle soot, and your stomach is waging war against your entire being. You head back to your room, past a group of students arguing loudly about whether time exists independently or is just the measure of motion. One of them is standing on a barrel to make his point. You do not stop to ask questions. Back at your room, you collapse onto your straw mattress and stretch out like a dying cat. Your notes are a mess of scribbles, underlines, and random doodles that may or may not be planets. You light your candle and flip through them, trying to decipher your own handwriting. You're not sure if you learned anything today, but you do feel like something shifted, like your brain cracked open just a little, just enough to let in something new. You close your notes, blow out the candle, and wrap your cloak around yourself like a burrito of despair. Above you, the pigeons are silent for once. Maybe they're contemplating Aristotle too, or maybe they just froze. Either way, you sleep hard, already bracing yourself for tomorrow's lecture. Because it turns out learning how the universe works is exhausting, especially when your universe involves freezing stone benches and the ever-present smell of turnips. There's a sharp knock on your door before dawn, followed by a voice that mutters your name and something that sounds suspiciously like a challenge. You sit up, bleary-eyed and confused. Is this a robbery? A summons? Some medieval version of a prank? No, it's worse. It's an invitation to your first disputation, the kind where you don't just sit in the back and take notes, but stand, speak, and try very hard not to humiliate yourself in front of half the university. This is the academic rite of passage here, the disputatio. It's not optional, it's not forgiving, and it's not something you can fake your way through. You're going to be questioned, countered, possibly mocked, and hopefully not emotionally annihilated. You take a deep breath and open the door. The student standing there nods and hands you a scrap of parchment, with a thesis scribbled across it. Whether universals exist outside the mind. You stare at it like it just insulted your mother. You have one day to prepare. There's no guidebook, no PowerPoint slides, no cozy review session. Instead, you gather what notes you have, bribe a senior student for a glossed copy of Porphyry, and lock yourself in your room with a crust of bread, a stub of candle, and an ever-deepening sense of existential dread. You mutter Latin phrases under your breath like prayers. You rehearse arguments aloud until the guy in the next room starts banging on the wall. You practice saying distinguo in as many tones of voice as possible. It's Latin for I distinguish, and it's your best friend in a disputation. When in doubt, distinguish. Disputation is not just a fancy word for debate. It's a blood sport. You stand before your peers and masters, present a thesis, and defend it against every verbal spear thrown at you. Your opponents, students, or sometimes even professors, try to destroy your argument with counterexamples, logic twists, obscure references, and just enough sarcasm to sting, but not technically get them excommunicated. You arrive the next morning in the college's oratory, which has been transformed for the event. A raised platform holds a lectern. Candles flicker in iron holders. The walls are lined with dark wood, probably older than anyone in the room. There are at least 20 students already gathered, some chatting nervously, others sharpening quills like they plan to take notes, or use them as weapons. Your opponent stands across from you, a second-year student with a reputation for speed-talking and smugness. Perfect. The magister presiding over the disputation enters last. He's tall, silent, and wrapped in a robe so dark it seems to absorb light. He gives a small nod, then gestures to you. Time to begin. You open with the thesis. Your voice shakes slightly. I propose that universals exist not merely as mental concepts, but as real entities existing independently. A bold stance, depending on which philosopher you've read last. Your opponent's eyebrow arches. You continue, citing Aristotle, then cautiously pulling in a line from Boethius. You finish with a slightly mangled Latin phrase that you hope sounded confident, but may have translated to, "The pudding is real." Then comes the attack. Your opponent wastes no time. If universals exist outside the mind, he says, then why do they not exist identically for all minds? Does the form of horse exist independently, even when no one thinks of horses? And if so, where is this horse? He says horse like it's an insult. You respond. You distinguish. You dodge and parry with every scrap of logic you've memorized in the last 2 weeks. You quote Augustine, then Plato, then try to weave them into your own argument. It's messy, passionate, and occasionally incoherent, but you're holding your own. You feel it. You're not winning exactly, but you're not going down in flames either. Here's your historical fact. Disputations weren't just student exercises. They were central to university education, held weekly or even daily in some faculties. They mirrored the Church's own methods for handling heresy and doctrine. In fact, many of the greatest medieval thinkers, Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, Abelard, became famous not for books, but for their skill in these brutal intellectual showdowns. The session drags on for over an hour. The magister occasionally grunts or raises a bony finger when he wants clarification. Once he interrupts to demand a proper citation. Your brain scrambles, and you throw out a date that might not exist. You see a few students smirk. At one point, someone in the back starts to nod off, and your opponent, ever the showman, calls it out. Even my colleague's logic sends others into metaphysical slumber. You roll your eyes, but you're secretly impressed. That was a solid burn. And here's your quirky fact. Students sometimes use coded signals during disputations. A tug of the sleeve, a scratch of the nose, little gestures to warn friends of incoming traps, or remind them of forgotten arguments. These secret moves were usually frowned upon, but unless you were spectacularly obvious, the masters let them slide, just part of the game. After what feels like days, the magister calls a halt. He stands, speaks a few words in Latin, then declares both sides acceptable in their reasoning. That's about as close to praise as you'll ever get. Your opponent gives you a small, respectful nod. You return it, still shaking slightly. The crowd disperses. Some students come over to slap you on the back. Others offer unsolicited critiques of your performance. You should have pressed the thing about particulars, says one. Too much Plato, says another. You thank them politely while silently plotting to never speak to them again. You walk home in a daze, mind still buzzing. The arguments replay in your head, along with all the things you wish you'd said. You half expect to dream about abstract forms and categories of being tonight. You probably will. Here's the scholarly debate. Were these disputations effective educational tools or just academic theatre? Some historians argue they sharpened reasoning and memory, creating intellectual discipline. Others say they encouraged empty rhetoric over genuine understanding. You, however, are too tired to care about the philosophy of pedagogy right now. You just want to sleep for a week. Back in your room, you collapse on your cot. Your notes are still on your shelf, your ink still drying. You stare at the ceiling and let the silence wrap around you. You did it. You stood, argued, held your ground, and didn't vomit or burst into flames. That's a win. And maybe, just maybe, you kind of liked it. By now you've developed an intimate relationship with the concept of hunger. Not the casual, guess I could eat kind of hunger, but the full-bodied, gnawing, philosophical kind. The kind that makes you question whether knowledge really is more important than dinner. Because frankly, if you hear one more lecture about the divine order of the cosmos while your stomach sounds like a dying organ, you might lose your mind. Mealtimes are erratic at best. Your college, if it provides meals at all, does so in the loosest interpretation of the word meal. Twice a week you're given a bowl of lentil stew, some dry bread, and if the stars align and God feels generous, a piece of onion. You've started dreaming about onions, which feels like a low point, but here we are. The stew itself is more water than anything else, with a few sad pulses floating like shipwreck survivors in the murky broth. Sometimes it's hot, sometimes it's just the colour of regret. Today, you make the trek to one of the local taverns that cater to students. The Bent Quill, a cramped smoky place tucked between a candlemaker's shop and a vendor who may or may not be selling legally obtained shoes. The Bent Quill is dimly lit, smells vaguely of stale beer and academic despair, and serves a stew that is only marginally better than your college's offering. But it's warm, it comes with bread, and no one judges you for eating it with your fingers because spoons are rare and overrated. You sit at a splintered wooden table with 3 other students, all of whom look like they haven't seen daylight in weeks. They're arguing about the proper interpretation of a line from Cicero while slurping from their bowls. You listen in, too tired to participate, and tear off chunks of bread with the quiet intensity of someone trying to make a meal last longer than it deserves. Here's your historical fact. Medieval university students often lived at the edge of poverty. Many relied on the goodwill of their colleges, local churches, or their own ingenuity to survive. Some earned their meals by tutoring younger students, singing in choirs, or working as copyists. Others, especially those who had absolutely nothing, begged for food, sometimes sanctioned by the university itself. It wasn't just allowed, it was expected. Being poor was practically part of the job description. Of course, if you had money, real money, things looked a little different. Wealthier students lived in private lodgings, paid for personal tutors, and ate meat more than once a month. Meat. A luxury most of your classmates can only fantasize about while chewing on leathery crusts of rye bread. You're not one of those students, obviously. Your budget is more peasant chic than noble scholar. But there are ways to supplement your diet if you're creative. You learn to linger near churches after Mass, where leftovers from religious feasts sometimes trickle down to the needy. You befriend bakers' apprentices who occasionally sneak you stale rolls, and you get to know the rhythm of the city, who has food on which days, which vendors are generous, and which taverns will let you wash dishes in exchange for a mug of thin ale and a bowl of porridge. Here's a quirky fact. Some students tried to brew their own beer in their dorm rooms, with predictably awful results. One such operation, run out of a rented room near the Rue Saint-Jacques, exploded after someone miscalculated the fermentation process. The resulting mess reportedly covered 3 students and a copy of the Consolation of Philosophy in a thin layer of hoppy foam. The text was never the same. As the week grinds on, your appetite becomes both a distraction and a motivator. It's hard to focus on the divine nature of truth when your insides feel like they're eating themselves. But hunger also makes you sharper, more aware, more resourceful. You become the kind of person who notices when the bread delivery arrives, the kind of person who, knows that one of the monks at the college kitchen has a soft spot for students who compliment his Latin pronunciation. One night, while studying by candlelight and chewing the last of a nearly fossilised carrot, you stumble across a reference in your notes to a banquet of the mind. It's a metaphor used by one of the masters to describe how learning satisfies the soul in the same way food satisfies the body. You scoff. You'd still prefer an actual banquet, thanks. But still, you get it. You're feeding something here, even if it's not your stomach. You're learning to think in new ways, to question assumptions, to piece together ideas that seemed impossibly abstract just a few weeks ago. Your hunger isn't just physical anymore, it's intellectual. And though one might be louder than the other, both are real. And here's the open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue about the quality and quantity of student diets in medieval universities. Some sources suggest conditions were terrible, students literally starving, stealing, or collapsing from malnutrition. Others paint a more moderate picture. Frugal, yes, but survivable, especially for those enrolled in colleges with regular endowments. The truth, as always, probably lies somewhere in the middle, highly variable depending on location, college wealth, and just how lucky, or unlucky, you were. Tonight there's a special occasion. A senior student has managed to get his degree, and in celebration he's invited several classmates to a small gathering. You're not quite friends with him, but you know someone who is, and that's good enough. You show up to the rented hall behind a spice seller's shop, where a fire crackles and students gather around wooden platters of bread, cheese, onions, and, miracle of miracles, meat. Sausages specifically. Fatty, fragrant, and probably questionable in origin, but who cares? You eat slowly, reverently. Every bite feels like a reward for all the cold mornings, aching limbs, and endless lectures. Someone passes you a mug of wine, and you sip it like it's ambrosia. Students sing bawdy songs in Latin, someone starts a debate about whether God could have created garlic, and you lean back, full for the first time in weeks. For a few hours you feel something close to joy, not just because you're no longer hungry, but because you're surrounded by people who, despite their exhaustion and ink-stained fingers, still find reasons to laugh, argue, and raise a toast to surviving another week. You return to your room a little buzzed, a lot full and entirely too content. Your blanket feels warmer tonight, the straw less lumpy. You fall asleep dreaming of logic and lentils and sausages wrapped in parchment. Because in the medieval university, even the smallest feast is something worth remembering. It's a quiet morning for once. No one's shouting in the street, no bells are clanging in your ears, and even the pigeons on the roof are eerily silent, as if they too are bracing for what's coming. Today you're entering the linguistic crucible of the medieval university, the Latin-only rule. From the moment you set foot on university grounds, you're expected to speak, write, argue, and even insult your peers in Latin. It's not a suggestion, it's the law. Violating it isn't just frowned upon, it can get you publicly scolded, fined, or, in especially strict colleges, beaten with a stick. Because apparently nothing says education like being whacked for saying hello in your native tongue. To be fair, you do speak Latin, sort of. Enough to get through lectures, enough to follow disputations, even to argue in one if you're having a good day and no one uses vocabulary from before the First Crusade. But casual Latin, conversational Latin, that's an entirely different beast. You're used to Latin as a written language, a scholarly language, formal, slow, and full of carefully structured syntax. Speaking it fluently, that's like writing a poem during a foot race while someone's throwing onions at your head. As you head to the college courtyard, where a group of students is gathering to prepare for the day's exercises, you brace yourself for the usual linguistic humiliation. One student, a lanky fellow from Picardy with a smirk permanently etched into his face, delights in catching others slipping into the vernacular. Yesterday he slapped another student on the shoulder and bellowed, "Loquer Latin, stulte!" Speak Latin, fool. The poor guy had only asked to borrow a quill. This obsession with Latin has its reasons. Here's your historical fact. Latin was the lingua franca of the medieval university system. It unified scholars across borders, French, English, German, Italian, Spanish, all communicating in the same language of learning. It wasn't just tradition, it was a necessity. A Parisian student could study in Bologna, or Oxford or Salamanca without ever needing to learn a new language. As long as he had Latin, he could learn anywhere. at least in theory. Of course, in practice, student Latin is its own peculiar dialect. There's High Latin, which the masters speak, flawless, crisp, unnervingly precise. And then there's the version you hear among the students. It's half classical, half vernacular, sprinkled with slang, errors, and a sort of desperate improvisation. Some students joke that they're speaking Canis Latinis, dog Latin. You're probably guilty of that yourself. Today's class is a group tutorial in rhetoric, taught by a young master who still looks like he gets mistaken for a student. He greets everyone with a cheerful Salvete discipuli and launches into an exercise that makes your stomach knot. Impromptu debate. All in Latin, no notes, no mercy. You're paired with another student and given your topic, whether it is better to be feared than loved. The Machiavellian vibes are strong, even, though Machiavelli hasn't been born yet. You try to stall by slowly repeating the thesis aloud, Utrum sit melius timeri quam amari, but your opponent is already warming up with a barrage of queer-based sentences, his voice rising like a Latin opera singer. You scramble to respond, flinging verbs and nouns together like mismatched puzzle pieces, praying they land in the right order. Your opponent smirks as you mix up dat and day, and your brain fizzles as you forget the future passive participle entirely. Still, you hold the line. You use ergo twice in one sentence, and while it doesn't really make sense, it sounds convincing. You even get a quiet nod from the master. Here's a quirky fact. Students used to insult each other in Latin as part of training. It wasn't just allowed, it was encouraged. The logic was that if you could insult someone eloquently, you were mastering both the language and the art of rhetoric. There's even a recorded case of two students getting into a poetic insult duel, where they hurled metrically correct invectives at each other until one fainted from embarrassment. You've never seen anything quite that dramatic, but you have heard someone call another student a sinus grammaticus, a grammar donkey, which earned a round of applause. After the class ends, you linger with a few classmates in the courtyard, and the conversation, of course, stays in Latin. It's clunky. You all stumble. You rely on hand gestures, awkward pauses, and the occasional cough to cover your mistakes. But somehow, it works. You joke about the debate, laugh at your mangled syntax, and manage a decent discussion about the best tavern on the left bank. You feel a small, strange pride bloom in your chest. Later that day, you visit the college chapel for afternoon prayer. Latin, again, fills the space. Psalms sung in long, droning verses, the sound echoing against cold stone. You mumble along, only catching fragments. But the language is beautiful here, less stiff, less threatening. In this moment, it feels like something sacred. The same Latin that trips you up in class now flows like water. And here's the scholarly debate. How fluent were medieval students in spoken Latin, really? Some scholars argue that they were conversational, even witty, switching between Latin and their native tongues with ease. Others suggest most students memorised just enough to survive classes and stumbled through speech like tourists ordering lunch in a foreign country. Judging by your experience, the truth probably lies in between. You can speak it, yes, but only with effort, and only when you're not being yelled at by a grammar-obsessed Picardian. That evening, you find yourself walking past a group of younger students arguing about prepositions. You pause, listen, and then, without thinking, offer a correction. Come takes the ablative, you mutter. They glance at you, surprised, and nod. You walk away before they can ask you to explain further, a little stunned that you knew that off the top of your head. Back in your room, you light your candle, pull out your notes, and read aloud. Not silently, not in your head. You speak, in Latin, slowly, haltingly. The words taste different when they come from your mouth instead of someone else's. But they're yours now. You've earned them. It's not perfect. You still forget conjugations, you still mix up ut and knee, and you still accidentally call people body parts when you mean to compliment their argument. But you're learning. You're speaking. You're part of the conversation now. You fall asleep that night thinking in Latin, dreaming in fragments of declensions and rhetorical questions. Because at the medieval university, language isn't just how you learn. It is the learning. And slowly, painfully, gloriously, you're getting fluent. It starts with a shout, then another, Then something crashes, wood on stone, and someone screams, not out of pain, but out of pure, unfiltered rage. You rush to your window, shove the warped shutter aside, and see the chaos below. A group of students in dark robes locked in a very literal street fight with townspeople. Someone is swinging a bench leg like a club. Another is hurling what looks suspiciously like a fish. It's not a riot yet, but it's close. Welcome to your first taste of town versus gown, the centuries-old, barely contained animosity between university students and the townsfolk who have to live with them. You've heard rumours about this. Everyone has. But now it's real. And it's not just a one-time flare-up. This kind of conflict is baked into the system. The university isn't just a school, it's a legal island, a little academic kingdom inside the city. Students, remember, are considered part of the clergy, which means they're not subject to local law. Steal a chicken? The bishop has to deal with it. Get drunk and start a fire in a tavern? Church court. It's an arrangement that might sound good on paper, until you realise it breeds resentment like mould on cheese. Here's your historical fact. Throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, student town conflicts were common in places like Paris, Oxford and Bologna. In Oxford, one infamous riot in 1355, sparked by a student complaining about the quality of wine, ended with nearly 100 people dead and the university placed under royal protection. The anniversary was marked for centuries with an official apology from the city. So yeah, town and gown was less a cultural divide and more of a full-blown blood feud. Today's eruption started small, as they often do. A student, drunk, loud, and full of Aristotelian confidence, refused to pay for a meal at a local tavern. When the tavern keeper objected, the student threw a cup at him. The tavern keeper swung back, the student ran to fetch his friends. The tavern keeper called in his cousins. And just like that, we have a medieval street brawl with philosophical undertones. By mid-morning, the university is buzzing. You overhear a group of older students planning to retaliate. "We'll teach those pigs not to touch one of ours," someone growls, adjusting the knot on his belt where a small dagger hangs. Another laughs and says, "I'll bet half the town can't even conjugate esse." The arrogance is staggering and dangerous. The college heads respond by calling for calm. Flyers go up warning students to avoid public assemblies. A few are confined to their dormitories, but no one's really afraid of consequences. Not the students, anyway. If anyone's going to get punished, it's the tavern keeper. Or maybe no one. Maybe it all just dissolves into memory, like the last 5 flare-ups this semester. You, meanwhile, are just trying to survive without getting your head cracked open. You step carefully around the Rue du Foire that afternoon, eyes scanning for signs of tension. There's broken glass in the gutter, and someone's chalked a crude Latin insult on the side of a merchant's stall. Rusticus ignorans. Peasant ignoramus. Subtle. You duck into a nearby bookseller's stall, partially for safety, partially because you heard he just got a fresh shipment of glossed theological commentaries. Inside, the shop is quiet. A few students are huddled in the back, murmuring about the incident. One of them, a lanky Italian who always seems half asleep during lectures, claims to have seen the whole thing and now thinks the tavern keeper might have been a heretic. That's the kind of leap only a hungry, overworked university student could make. You nod solemnly. You're not getting involved. Here's a quirky fact. Students often formed gangs. Not official ones, but informal groups based on region or college affiliation. These nations sometimes operated like protective brotherhoods, especially when fights broke out. If one student was attacked, the rest would rally to defend him, sometimes escalating the conflict to absurd levels. One scholar likened it to academic mafias, complete with oaths, codes, and secret signals. It's all fun and games until someone ends up with a broken arm over a misquoted line from Cicero. You head back to your college before nightfall. The streets feel tense. People walk faster. Doors are closed tighter. A few local boys shout insults as you pass, calling you a robe-clad devil and spitting in the street. You keep your head down. No point in fighting. You're not brave enough, or stupid enough, to throw yourself into a student brawl. You're still nursing a bruised shin from tripping over a bench last week. That night, in the safety of your room, you listen to the muffled sounds of shouting outside, the occasional clatter of boots on cobblestones, the distant clanging of a warning bell. It feels less like a university town and more like a city under siege. Here's the scholarly debate. Some historians argue that these conflicts were a natural outcome of class tension. Students, often from elite or wealthy families, acting like arrogant invaders in working-class neighbourhoods. Others point to the legal system that protected students and let them behave with impunity, creating a toxic imbalance. And still others say it was just youth and testosterone, the same age-old cocktail that's been fueling bar fights since the invention of mead. You lie back on your straw mattress staring at the ceiling beams, wondering if tomorrow will bring another fight, or maybe a curfew, or worse, university sanctions. Probably not. The university rarely takes action unless someone important gets injured. And even then, it's usually just a stern warning and a mass of reconciliation. Still, you can't shake the feeling that you're living in a pressure cooker. The students feel invincible, the townsfolk feel cornered, and all it takes is one more spark to blow everything up again. You blow out your candle, hoping tonight will be quiet. No arguments, no drunken singing, no battles outside your window. Just the silence of parchment, the scratch of quills, and maybe, if you're lucky, the distant hoot of an owl. But deep down, you know better. It doesn't take long for you to notice how differently people look at you now. Not with admiration, not with fear, but with a particular kind of side-eye that says, "Ah, another one of them." You've become, unmistakably and visibly, a student. It's not just the ink-stained fingers or the hollow-cheeked hunger look that gives you away. It's the cloak, the scholar's robe, the long dark garment you were issued at enrolment, which you now wear daily like a badge, a target, and sometimes, if it's cold enough, a blanket. It's not fancy. You don't exactly stride through the cobbled streets like some academic wizard. It's plain wool, scratchy, and smells faintly of mildew no matter how many times you air it out. But that robe marks you. It tells everyone you're part of the university. It means you belong to a privileged class of wandering minds, even if you personally feel more like a disoriented farmhand who accidentally walked into the wrong building and got handed a textbook. At first, you liked it. The identity, the recognition. It felt official, regal even. But over time, you've noticed how the townsfolk's eyes linger when you pass. Sometimes with suspicion, sometimes with disdain, occasionally with something bordering on contempt. That robe says, "I'm not subject to your laws." It says, "I'm exempt from your taxes." And unfortunately, it also says, "I might get drunk and break your window and never face consequences." You haven't broken anyone's window, of course. You've barely broken your bread in half some days. But still, you walk the streets now knowing that your clothing paints a narrative before you've said a word. Here's your historical fact. Student robes were standardized by many universities, partly to distinguish scholars from ordinary townspeople, and partly to instill discipline. Robes were modelled after clerical garments because technically, students were clergy in training, or at least clerks in the church's legal sense. Even if you had no intention of becoming a priest, the robe linked you to that world. It was a symbol of knowledge, but also of authority. And sometimes, people don't really like authority. Today you're reminded of this firsthand when a group of younger town boys throws mud at you as you cross a bridge. It splatters across your cloak with a wet slap, and for a moment you just stand there, stunned, blinking at the mess sliding down your sleeve. The boys laugh and disappear down an alley before you can respond. Not that you'd know what to do anyway. Chase them, scold them in Latin, quote Boethius at them until they die of confusion. Instead, you wipe off what you can and keep walking. Later, while trying to clean the robe in a freezing stream behind your college, you find yourself wondering how others see you now. Not just townsfolk, but your fellow students, your masters, the church. Does the robe really make you part of something bigger? Or does it just hide the fact that you're still figuring everything out? Beneath it, you're just you. Tired, hungry, slightly overwhelmed, and clinging to the hope that knowledge might eventually make sense. That night, over watery stew and questionable bread, you fall into conversation with another student about the way clothes shape perception. He's from Florence, older, sharp-tongued, and a little too fond of quoting Ovid. He lifts his bowl in a mock toast and says, "Vestes faciant philosophum." Clothes make the philosopher, you snort. Or they just make us easier to blame for everything. He laughs and mutters, "Also true." Here's a quirky fact. Some students rebelled against the robe requirement. They wore brightly coloured hoods, stitched rude words in Latin into the linings, or secretly altered their garments with elaborate cuts and flourishes that made them look more like performers than scholars. At one point, the University of Paris issued a formal decree banning scandalous embroidery on academic robes. That's how serious things got. God forbid your hemline expresses personality. But the robe isn't just a costume, it's also practical. You learn how to wrap it tighter against the wind, how to fold the sleeves when writing, how to drape it over your knees for warmth during lectures. You even learn to sleep in it, half-dressed and ready for whatever the next day throws at you, be it an early mass, a disputation, or another philosophical rock fight with the locals. And despite everything, there's still a strange pride in wearing it. You've earned your place here. You've sat through brutal lectures, argued in Latin while half-starved, and memorised passages of Aristotle under candlelight with frozen fingers. The robe may make you a target, but it also marks you as someone who's made it through the first layer of medieval academic hell. Here's the scholarly debate. Some argue that the uniformity of dress helped cultivate a shared scholarly identity, a kind of intellectual brotherhood that transcended national or class boundaries. Others suggest it reinforced elitism and separated students from the working class communities they lived among. You can feel both truths brushing up against each other every time you walk down the street, caught between the world of learning and the world of everyone else. On your way back from evening prayer, you spot a small group of townsfolk gathered near a vendor's cart. One of them sees you and says something under his breath. You don't catch it, but you catch the tone. Another glance, another shrug. You pull your hood up and keep walking. You're used to it now. In your room, you hang the robe by the door. It's damp again, a little stiff, but still intact. You smooth the folds with your hands. For all its trouble, you need it. You need what it represents. Structure, purpose, belonging. Even if you feel like a fraud half the time wearing it. You blow out your candle and crawl into your scratchy bedding. In the darkness, the robe hangs like a shadow of something larger than yourself. Tomorrow you'll put it back on. You always do. Because here, the robe isn't just clothing, it's armour. You're awake before the bells today, which is never a good sign. Your heart's racing, your stomach's twisting, and your mind's playing the same sentence on a loop. Today is your exam. It's not a written test, not in the neat, controlled way you're probably used to. There's no paper, no multiple choice, no essays quietly scribbled in a corner with a half-chewed quill. No, here at the medieval university, an exam means one thing: oral disputation in public, with your academic survival and your pride on the line. You've seen them before, of course. Watched other students stand in the stone hall with the eyes of masters, classmates, and bored bystanders burning holes into their robes. You've even whispered critiques afterward, playing the quiet Monday morning quarterback with lines like, "He fumbled the reply to the third objection," or "He forgot to cite Anselm, rookie mistake." But now it's your turn to walk into that room, step into the intellectual arena, and do your best not to collapse into a puddle of stammering Latin and flop sweat. You've been preparing for days, weeks technically. You've reviewed your notes so many times you can recite most of them by heart. You've memorised whole passages from Peter Lombard and Aristotle, practised rhetorical flourishes, and even coached yourself through imaginary questions in the mirror, until your own reflection started looking unimpressed. But nothing prepares you for the real thing: the gravity, the setting, the smell. The examination hall is a large, echo-prone chamber with a domed ceiling and stained glass windows that cast faint, coloured shadows across the stone floor. Wooden benches are arranged in rows, already occupied by students from multiple colleges, some leaning forward eagerly, others slumped like they're hoping for a quick and painless academic death. At the front of the room sits the panel. 2 masters and 1 external examiner, a guest from another university who looks like he eats failed students for breakfast. You stand when your name is called. Your knees crack like old hinges. The master reads your question aloud. It's a whopper. Whether human will is free in the state of grace. You take a shaky breath and begin. First, the structure. Present your thesis, cite authorities, provide logical support, anticipate counter-arguments. Your voice trembles at first, but you find your footing. You quote Augustine, cautiously reference Lombard, then distinguish between types of grace, as you practiced. The Latin comes more easily than expected, maybe because your brain is too scared to do anything but comply. Then come the objections. The first is straightforward. If grace is from God, and God is all-powerful, how can human will still be considered free? You counter with a glossa from a sermon you once copied by candlelight. The examiner raises an eyebrow but says nothing. Good sign. The second objection is trickier. It comes from the external examiner, of course. He poses a hypothetical that requires you to juggle theology, logic, and a reference to a passage in the Book of Wisdom you barely remember. You feel your confidence wobble, but you recover. You distinguish, redefine, loop back to your original claim. You're basically building a castle out of matchsticks and string, but somehow it holds. Then there's silence. That silence lasts longer than it should. You feel the sweat collecting at the base of your spine, soaking into your robe. One master leans forward. Do you hold, then, that free will remains undisturbed in the presence of divine intervention? You freeze. You blink. Your mind flips through its internal filing system like a monk sorting through scrolls in a fire. Then you answer, softly but clearly, I do, provided that the will cooperates by inclination rather than resistance. More silence, then a nod. The masters consult briefly. You're dismissed. No applause, no flowers, no tearful handshakes, just a wave of the hand and the faintest grunt of approval. You step outside into the cold air, your legs barely cooperating. The noise of the street hits you like a wave. Merchants shouting, hooves clattering on stones, someone singing off-key nearby. You walk aimlessly, dazed, the way someone walks after being punched in the head and told they did a great job. Here's your historical fact. Oral exams were the norm in medieval universities. They were public, grueling, and often decisive. A strong performance could launch a student's academic career. A weak one could set him back months, even years. Masters were known for asking increasingly abstract or obscure questions, testing not just memory, but agility, poise, and theological orthodoxy. It was part learning assessment, part spectacle, and part stress test. You find yourself in the courtyard of your college, where a few other students are waiting for their own examinations. One of them asks how it went. You shrug. Say something vague like, it could have been worse. Another says, they say if the external examiner doesn't interrupt you mid-answer, you've passed. You cling to that. Here's a quirky fact. There were exam superstitions. Students carried lucky tokens, relics, carved wooden charms, even small bones from saints if they could get them. One popular belief held that urinating on your opponent's study notes brought you good luck, and then bad memory. Naturally, no one admits to doing it, but everyone suspects someone who did. That night, you attend a quiet gathering of other students who've recently endured their own examinations. There's cheap wine, burnt onions, and endless retellings of who fumbled what. Someone describes an exam question that involved whether angels could change their minds. Someone else tells a horror story about a student who froze so badly, he answered in his native French, and then cried. You laugh along, even though your body is still vibrating with nerves. At one point you slip outside for air and find yourself looking up at the stars, the same stars that Aquinas wrote about, the same ones early astronomers used to track divine harmony. You wonder if they ever had to stand in front of a panel and explain the nature of will under the light of God. Probably not. Here's the scholarly debate. Was the oral exam a true test of learning, or just a performance? Some argue it encouraged memorization and favoured the confident over the thoughtful. Others say it was a brilliant way to assess comprehension, force clarity, and teach students to think on their feet. You have no answer, at least not one you'd want to deliver in front of a room of judges. But you do know this. You're still standing. You spoke, you argued, and you weren't struck down by divine lightning or scholarly shame. Back in your room, you light a candle, sit at your table, and add a small mark in the corner of your notebook. Nothing elaborate, just a dot. A small sign to remind yourself. Today, you passed. And even if they don't say it out loud, you know the masters saw it too. There's a question that's been floating in your mind ever since you arrived. One that no one really talks about directly, but you can't help but ask it now and then. Usually when you catch your reflection in the water bucket or hear your own voice echoing in the lecture hall full of men, where are the women? Because here, in this tangle of theology and logic, of argument and ink, it's strikingly clear, almost aggressively so, that your academic world is almost entirely male. The professors, the students, the priests, even the scribes copying out texts in the cold back rooms of the college are men. The only women you regularly encounter are the ones cleaning the dormitories, selling bread in the streets, or watching scholars with a mixture of amusement and caution from behind market stalls. It's not just absence, it's silence. There are no female voices in disputations, no women rising to challenge a master's interpretation of Aristotle, and the few women whose names appear in the margins of manuscripts are usually there because someone's copying out a condemnation, a warning, or a miracle story. Knowledge here is guarded like a monastery gate, and most women aren't even allowed to knock. Still, you begin to ask around. Quietly, of course. One afternoon, while chatting with an older student who seems to know everything about everything and loves proving it, you broach the topic. He raises an eyebrow. Women, he says. They have their own schools, convents. Some learn to read, even write. Then he leans in, lowering his voice. But the university? That's no place for women. Imagine the distraction. The scandal. Scandal. That's the word that always surfaces. It's not that women can't learn, you realise. It's that people fear what will happen if they do. Knowledge is power, and power is supposed to have a beard. Here's your historical fact. Most medieval universities were closed to women. The institutions were structured as clerical communities, bound by canon law, which generally forbade women from teaching or even attending lectures. A few exceptions existed. Rare, often noble-born women who learned through private tutors or within religious communities. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, wrote extensively on theology, medicine and science. But she was an outlier. A brilliant one, yes, but still an exception to a rule written in thick ecclesiastical ink. Rumours float through the student ranks of one woman who tried to enrol at Bologna disguised as a man. Depending on who tells the story, she either graduated top of her class before revealing her identity, or was caught mid-disputation and banished, or killed, or married. It's hard to say. The story changes every time, but it's always told with a mix of admiration and incredulity, like a myth just believable enough to unsettle the status quo. And here's a quirky fact for you. One manuscript recovered from a 14th century monastery contains marginalia featuring a series of small illustrations. A woman in robes standing at a lectern, teaching a group of tiny open-mouthed men. Scholars don't know if it was a joke, a fantasy, or an early protest scribbled by a bored monk. But it's there. A woman, teaching. And for a second, you like to imagine it wasn't fiction. One evening, in the candlelit scriptorium, you stumble across a commentary that mentions a woman named Trotta of Salerno, an expert in medicine, praised for her knowledge of women's health. You blink at the name, run your finger across the vellum, reread it twice. It's the first female name you've seen cited without scorn. The first sign that maybe, somewhere beyond the cold walls of your university, women are learning too, just not here, not with you. There's an unspoken rule that you don't ask about the absence, that if you question it too loudly you'll be accused of wasting time or worse, corrupting your soul with dangerous ideas. But the questions linger. You think about your mother, your sister, your cousin who was always the cleverest of the lot. You imagine them sitting in a lecture hall, eyes shining, hands raised, and then you remember they never got the chance. Here's the scholarly debate. How many women were actually educated in the medieval world, and to what extent? Some argue that literacy among women, especially those in religious life, was higher than previously thought. Convents had libraries, and many nuns were well versed in Latin and scripture. Others contend that this literacy was often limited to prayer and rote memorization, with little access to philosophical or scientific texts. The truth, as usual, is uneven, dependent on class, geography, family, and the whims of history. You start to pay more attention in the streets now. You notice a girl following her mother through the market with a basket of eggs, pausing to listen, as a student reads aloud from a scroll to his friends. Her eyes linger, just for a moment. Then she's gone. You notice a woman sweeping a step while mouthing the Latin words from a church hymn, her lips moving in rhythm with the chant you sang earlier at Mass. These are small moments, easily missed, but they remind you, curiosity isn't a male trait, it's human. One day, while walking past a scriptorium, you see a woman hunched over a parchment inside. She's not copying, she's reading, carefully, secretly. You glance in, and she looks up. There's a flicker of shared recognition between you. Not words, just a nod. And then you're gone, swallowed by the crowd. Back in your room that night, you write a single line in the margin of your notes. What would this look like if everyone were allowed to learn? You don't show it to anyone. You barely even look at it again. But it's there. A seed. You blow out your candle and lie in the dark, robe tucked around you like armour, head full of voices, masters, classmates, saints, philosophers, and one quiet voice you imagine, one that hasn't been given a place to speak. Yet, by now you've learned to watch your words. Not in the casual, everyday way, though calling your logic master a sinus under your breath is still a bad idea, but in a deeper, almost instinctive way. You're constantly measuring the weight of your sentences. Not just what you say, but how you say it, who you quote, which theologians you reference, whether that clever remark about the nature of evil might sound just a little too close to heresy. Because here at the medieval university, ideas aren't just for discussion, they're landmines, and the church is always listening. It's easy to forget in the daily grind of lectures and disputations just how tightly your education is tied to the church. You're not just learning theology, you're learning it their way, the correct way, the eternal truth as preserved by councils and codified by church fathers. Your master can push boundaries, test theories, flirt with the edge of unorthodoxy, but you're a student. You don't have that kind of safety net. Step out of line, and you don't just fail your course. You risk being hauled in front of an ecclesiastical court. This reality hits you hard today when a fellow student, someone you've argued with, laughed with, borrowed ink from, doesn't show up for class. At first, no one says anything. People just glance around, trying not to be the first to mention it. Then, quietly, someone mutters, "He asked the wrong question." You find out later that he was overheard challenging the doctrine of transubstantiation, not denying it, just questioning how the bread and wine could remain accidents, while being fully transformed into Christ's body and blood. It's a classic philosophical problem, really, but apparently someone reported him, and now he's being questioned. Everyone knows what that means. Here's your historical fact. Medieval universities operated under the watchful eye of the church. In places like Paris and Oxford, students and masters were subject to church law, and certain teachings, especially in theology, had to remain strictly orthodox. Stray too far from accepted doctrine, and you could be investigated for heresy. The Inquisition, formalised in the 13th century, wasn't just hunting witches in the countryside. It was very much involved in monitoring ideas within universities. This creates a particular kind of academic tension. On one hand, you're trained to think critically, to challenge arguments, to test and debate. On the other, you're told that some truths are beyond debate, and certain questions shouldn't even be asked. It's like being told to fence in a room full of priceless stained glass. One wrong move and everything shatters, including your future. Your master, to his credit, tries to walk the line. Today's lecture touches on divine foreknowledge, how God can know the future without violating human free will. It's thorny, complex, and the kind of topic that could turn into theological quicksand if handled poorly. He cites Augustine, then Aquinas, then quickly reminds everyone that speculation must always serve revelation. You nod along, you get it. Everyone's nervous. Later, during a casual debate in the courtyard, a student raises a hypothetical about the damned being aware of God's mercy. Another student interrupts him. Careful, that's borderline universalism. Everyone goes quiet. The conversation moves on, but the tension stays, like smoke in your clothes after a fire. Here's a quirky fact. Some students developed code words to talk about sensitive theological ideas without drawing attention. Our hungry friend might mean Pelagius. The tall Augustinian might refer to a controversial bishop. There's even a rumour that students at Bologna used a tavern menu as a cipher, turning heretical terms into food items. So if someone said, "I'll take the roasted lamb with pepper," it might have meant, "I'm reading Peter Abelard's condemned writings after sunset." Probably nonsense. Probably. But it tells you how carefully people had to navigate this world. That evening you find yourself alone in the college chapel, the light from a single candle flickering against the stone walls. You're supposed to be reviewing a passage from Aquinas, but instead your mind keeps drifting back to your missing classmate. You wonder what he's being asked. You wonder if he's scared. You wonder if next time it could be you. Here's the ongoing scholarly debate. How much freedom did medieval students really have to explore controversial ideas? Some argue that universities were places of great intellectual ferment, where even dangerous ideas could be discussed if done skillfully. Others say the structure was fundamentally conservative, reinforcing orthodoxy and silencing dissent. The truth is likely both. Students could ask bold questions, but only if they knew how to couch them in safe language. Only if they were careful, strategic, lucky. You think about the questions you've kept to yourself, the ones you've scribbled in the margins of your notes but never dared say aloud. You think about the times you nodded along even when the logic felt twisted, because it was safer to agree than to draw attention. You don't feel cowardly for it. Not really, just realistic. Back in your room, you unroll a scroll of notes and reread one of your disputation arguments. It's a good one. Tight, clear, even a little elegant. You're proud of it. But a line in the middle gives you pause. A quote from a lesser-known thinker who's been whispered about lately. You scratch it out, slowly, carefully. Replace it with a safer authority, just in case. Because here, in this world, safety is never just about staying warm or fed. It's about staying aligned, staying within the lines, and knowing exactly how far you can lean before something snaps. You blow out your candle. The room plunges into darkness, but your mind keeps spinning. You think of your friend, wherever he is now, and hope someone is listening. Kindly. Fairly. Though you know better. Because here at the medieval university, truth is sacred, but saying it wrong can cost you everything. There comes a point in every student's academic career, usually somewhere between your 5th sleepless night and your 12th debate about the metaphysical nature of rocks, when you realise something deeply, troublingly simple. You are broke. Not just, "I'll skip dinner and eat the crust from yesterday's bread" broke. No. This is, "My ink is gone and I can't afford another candle" broke. You're scraping the bottom of your coin pouch and finding only lint and a sad crumb that might once have been cheese. Medieval university life, as you've no doubt realised by now, is not designed for the financially comfortable. Tuition might be technically free, yes, since you're not paying a formal enrolment fee, but everything else? It adds up fast. Lodging, food, candles, ink, parchment, the occasional bribe to get your hands on a glossed copy of De Anima. Every syllable you learn seems to cost you a coin, so you do what every desperate student does. You hustle, you start small. You offer to help a wealthier student copy notes. Your handwriting is just legible enough, and your Latin is slightly less embarrassing than the average first year. In exchange, he gives you a heel of bread and a sliver of dried meat. Not exactly a salary, but it's something. Next, you start tutoring. A local merchant's son is being prepped for the church and needs help with basic grammar. You teach him 3 times a week in his family's cramped back room, while the smell of pickled fish drifts in from the shop. He pays in coppers, sometimes with a bonus herring. You don't ask questions. Here's your historical fact. Many medieval students supported themselves with odd jobs. Copying manuscripts was the most respectable, and the most brutal. A full-length theological treatise could take weeks to reproduce, and any mistake had to be scraped off the parchment and redone. Other students took up tutoring, letter writing for merchants, or even performing at taverns, singing or reciting poetry for coin. And yes, some went darker, gambling, stealing, or attaching themselves to wealthier students in suspiciously close arrangements. Your own path takes a less scandalous route. One evening, you're sitting in the corner of a candlelit tavern, trying to make one mug of weak ale last 4 hours, when a small, wiry man in a hood sits down beside you. He smells like garlic and ambition. "You a student?" he asks. You nod cautiously. He slides a folded parchment across the table. Copy this. 5 copies, no errors, tomorrow night. You pick it up and squint. It's a letter. Not too long, fairly straightforward Latin, though with a few odd turns of phrase. You should probably ask questions. You don't. You copy it carefully. Your script isn't beautiful, but it's clean. When you deliver the pages the next night, the man grins and hands you a silver coin. Silver. It feels like treasure. You try not to let your hands shake as you pocket it. You never find out what the letter was about. Here's a quirky fact. Students often developed little side businesses within the university ecosystem. One sold ink he made from wine sediment and soot. Another, somehow, created a small bookbinding racket using stolen thread and repurposed leather. There's even a tale of a student who ran an underground sausage ring, sneaking links into the dormitories wrapped in Latin verses, so the college porter wouldn't inspect them too closely. You'd laugh, but you know you'd eat contraband sausage in a heartbeat right now. The trick to surviving this life is balance. Work enough to stay afloat, but not so much that you fall behind. Study enough to keep up, but not so obsessively that you collapse from exhaustion. It's a tightrope walk, and no one hands you a pole for balance. One night you're up late copying a set of sermon notes for a monk who claims he accidentally set his own on fire. You suspect he never wrote them in the first place, but you need the coin too badly to press the matter. Your candle flickers, the ink dries awkwardly, your hand cramps, but you finish. As you blow out the flame, you hear the bells in the distance. It's nearly morning. You'll get maybe an hour of sleep before class. You roll up the parchment, tuck it under your cloak, and lean against the wall for just a moment. Just a breath. You wake up to sunlight. You're late. You dash through the streets with your robe flapping behind you like a wet banner, arrive panting at the lecture hall and slide onto the bench just as the master begins reading. He doesn't notice you, or he pretends not to. Either way, you're safe, for now. Here's the scholarly debate. Were medieval students truly impoverished en masse, or was that just a vocal subset of the population? Some argue that the image of the starving scholar has been over-romanticised, pointing to wealthy students with servants and comfortable housing. Others emphasise that the majority, especially those without noble lineage, lived hand to mouth, cobbling together income from scraps and favours. Your personal experience leans heavily toward the "this bread is mostly air" side of the argument. Some days you envy the wealthy students who never worry about coins. Other days, you're quietly proud of your scraped-together survival. You're not just learning theology and logic. You're learning how to endure, how to adapt, how to squeeze meaning and sustenance out of the narrowest margins. You spend your evenings now hunched over borrowed texts, your afternoons running messages between scholars, your mornings trying to remember if you've eaten yet. You're exhausted, ink-stained, and constantly calculating whether to spend your last coin on bread or wax. But you're still here, you're still learning, and somehow you're making it work. You hear it first as a whisper over stale bread and stew. Someone you know, a student from England, has packed his things and left. For Bologna, just like that. No farewell, no bitter letter. One day he was there, bent over a text in the corner of the scriptorium, muttering Latin under his breath. The next, gone. And now the whispers swirl with increasing frequency. More students are leaving, some for Bologna, others for Oxford, a few even heading to Montpellier for medicine. It's not a rebellion exactly, but something quieter, a scholarly migration, the kind that leaves behind half-finished friendships and empty benches. You ask around, no one gives a straight answer. Better masters, someone mutters. Fewer riots, says another. One student just shrugs and says, Paris is falling apart. And maybe it is. The city feels tense lately. The last town gown fight left a baker with a cracked skull, and a student was caught stealing meat from a cathedral kitchen. The church is breathing down everyone's necks after a popular master made a comment about the Holy Spirit that was, at best, edgy, and, at worst, probably grounds for excommunication. The university has issued new restrictions, curfews, inspections, a lecture schedule that somehow manages to make your days longer without adding any actual education. So when someone suggests you consider studying abroad, you don't laugh it off like you would have a few weeks ago. Instead, you lean in and ask, how? Here's your historical fact. Medieval universities were remarkably mobile institutions. A student enrolled at Paris could, under the right conditions, travel to Bologna, Oxford or Padua and continue their studies without starting over. There was no centralised transcript system, of course, but the shared structure of education and the universality of Latin made it possible. Some students wandered between schools for years, collecting lectures, building reputations and chasing famous masters like academic pilgrims. Bologna, you hear, is the heart of legal studies. Civil law, canon law, masters who don't just read the glosses but write them. The students there supposedly have more say in how the university runs. They elect their own representatives. They've even staged walkouts to protest high fees. It sounds romantic in that battered idealist kind of way. Less theology, more law. Less dogma, more structure. Oxford, by contrast, is newer, rougher, a kind of academic outpost in a rain-soaked corner of the world. But it's growing, and some of its masters have started to earn a reputation for challenging the older universities, not just with bold interpretations, but with bolder questions. It's said one of them dared to suggest that studying the natural world could reveal divine patterns just as clearly as scripture. Depending on who you ask, that's either genius or borderline heresy. You start dreaming about it, about travel, about new halls and strange dialects, about a life just slightly less familiar. It's not that you hate Paris, it's just maybe you've outgrown it, or maybe it's outgrowing you. But leaving isn't simple. You need money. You need permission. You need a reason that won't make your current masters think you're abandoning them, like a child walking out of confession halfway through. So you start laying the groundwork. Quiet inquiries, letters to travelling merchants, tentative discussions with students who've done it before. Here's a quirky fact. Student mobility sometimes caused diplomatic headaches. A mass exodus of scholars could cripple a city's economy, especially when towns depended on student rent and spending. After a riot in Oxford in 1209, for instance, many students fled to Cambridge, effectively founding a new university. And when Paris students went on strike in the 13th century, entire colleges were shuttered. One town even reportedly tried to bribe students not to leave by offering free bread and reduced lodging fees. It didn't work. The bread was terrible. Your own travel plan begins to take shape in the margins of your notes. Dates, contacts, costs. You trade a few books for coin. You pick up extra tutoring jobs. You ask your master for a letter of recommendation, carefully phrasing your request as a desire to expand your academic horizons, not run screaming from collapsing infrastructure. He frowns, then sighs, then unexpectedly agrees. That night, you sit with a friend over ale that tastes like smoke and regret, and he asks, "Do you really think it'll be better there?" You hesitate. "I don't know, but maybe it'll be different." And that's enough. Here's the scholarly debate. Did students move between universities primarily for intellectual reasons, or was it more practical? Some argue it was about chasing the best minds, finding the most exciting ideas. Others say it came down to economics, personal safety, or politics. If your current town hated students, or your master was on the verge of excommunication, or your dorm had bedbugs the size of sparrows, moving wasn't a choice, it was survival. You spend your last days in Paris tying up loose ends, saying vague goodbyes, not dramatic ones, no declarations, no weeping on stone steps, just quiet nods and shared bread, a final walk through the Latin Quarter at dawn. You pass by the halls where you first tried to pronounce Pre Decamenta without choking, the courtyard where you completely botched a logic exercise and someone applauded out of pity, the chapel where you memorised psalms until your jaw hurt, and then, one morning, before the bells ring, you gather your things, wrap your robe tightly around you, and walk out of Paris. The road ahead is long, muddy, and entirely uncertain, but you've got Latin in your mouth, ink on your hands, and the name of a master in Bologna who just might let you sit at the edge of his lectures if you arrive early and look serious. And sometimes that's all you need. It's been a month since you left Paris, and now, standing in the courtyard of a student tavern in Bologna, watching a half-drunk scholar recite Virgil while trying to balance a loaf of bread on his head, you're starting to understand something no lecture ever taught you. The medieval university is a machine of contradictions. Beneath all the solemn prayers and ink-stained scrolls, it runs on chaos, personality, and a kind of slow-burning madness. This isn't just about learning, it's about surviving with the learning. And tonight, as the sun dips behind the ochre rooftops and the wine flows like water, you realise that here, at least, the scholars aren't just thinking, they're living. You've found your way into a new rhythm, one that feels different from the grinding austerity of Paris. Bologna, with its warmer air and looser hierarchy, has a student culture that's more open, more volatile, and, if you're being honest, much more fun. The lectures are still rigorous, the masters just as sharp and severe, but the space between them is filled with something freer: song, laughter, debate fueled not by the fear of excommunication, but by an almost joyful hunger for contradiction. Tonight, you're attending what's called a convivium literarium, a literary banquet, though that's a generous title for what is essentially a student gathering in the back room of a tavern with cheap wine, scattered books, and a loosely organised agenda. Someone sings a hymn, someone else interrupts with a bawdy parody of it, someone passes around a parchment of satirical verses about Aristotle's metaphysics. No one knows who wrote it, but the line about prime movers and missing socks gets a round of applause. Here's your historical fact. Despite the rigid structure of medieval education, students often engaged in informal intellectual gatherings, convivia, poetry readings, impromptu disputations in taverns. Latin wasn't just the language of exams and theology. It was the medium for everything. Love poems, insults, drinking songs. The Carmina Burana, now famous thanks to dramatic orchestral renditions, originated in this world. Irreverent, rowdy, and scholarly in the weirdest, most chaotic way. The students around you represent a strange cast. There's a German who speaks 5 languages, but always forgets which one he's in. A Florentine who insists on quoting Dante even though nobody else has read him yet. A Catalan who claims he once kissed the relics of St. James, and a barmaid in the same week. And you, still half Parisian in your habits, occasionally catching yourself addressing people with too much formality. Someone fills your cup with wine that tastes like someone accidentally fermented sadness. You drink it anyway. Then a small performance begins. 2 students reenacting a famous disputation, one playing the role of a stubborn Aristotelian, the other a mocking Platonist. It's exaggerated, full of dramatic hand gestures and sarcastic Latin. At one point, the Aristotelian accuses the Platonist of living in the cave and decorating the walls. Someone spits wine from laughing too hard. It's absurd and brilliant, and more engaging than half the lectures you've sat through. Here's a quirky fact. Some medieval students wrote what we might now call academic satire, mock treatises that mimicked the form of serious scholarship but filled them with nonsense or social commentary. Titles like De Arte Bibendi, on the art of drinking, or Speculum Stultorum, the mirror of fools, circulated among students poking fun at pompous masters, bad Latin, and the endless obsession with categorising everything into neat, philosophical boxes. As the night goes on, the atmosphere thickens with smoke and debate. Someone launches into a real disputation about whether poetry is more divine than philosophy. It's half serious, half performance, but everyone listens. Someone else begins reciting a Latin poem about unrequited love, and for a brief, strange moment, the room softens. You glance around and realise that even in this noisy, irreverent space, everyone is learning. Not in the formal way, but in the way that knowledge seeps into your bones, through laughter, mistake, performance, and community. There's an argument near midnight about whether Plato's ideal republic would allow taverns. One student, red-faced and swaying slightly, insists that, without wine, the soul contracts. Another responds, yes, but too much, and it evaporates. The first student throws a crust of bread at him. The second catches it and bows. Here's the scholarly debate. Were these student parties and poetic gatherings a sign of decadence, or a vital part of university culture? Some historians view them as evidence of undisciplined youth, students wasting time and resources, spreading chaos, even descending into blasphemy. Others argue these moments were crucial, places where students could develop rhetoric, humour, identity. You don't need a formal disputation to sharpen your thinking. Sometimes a drunken conversation in a smoky room teaches you more about language and logic than 3 hours of syllogisms ever could. You leave the tavern just before dawn, shoes damp from spilled wine and your brain buzzing with half-remembered quotes and questions. The streets are quiet, the city still asleep under a lavender sky. You walk alone, the rhythm of a Latin drinking song still thudding somewhere in your chest. Back in your rented room, a creaky attic space above a cobbler's shop, you lie awake listening to the pigeons on the roof, thinking about everything that passed tonight. The jokes, the poetry, the strange beauty of a philosophy student singing about broken sandals and divine love in the same breath. You pull your cloak tighter and whisper a line someone shouted near the end of the night. Vita sin litteris mors est. A life without learning is death. And you think, yes, but maybe it's also this. Messy, joyful, irreverent learning that bleeds into song, and ends with someone trying to climb a bookshelf. You fall asleep with ink on your sleeve and a crumbled piece of bread in your pocket, dreaming of laughter in Latin and the quiet promise that, no matter where you go next, someone, somewhere, will be quoting Aristotle, probably while drunk. You've finally settled into something like a rhythm. Not comfort, not quite, but routine. You know which lectures are worth arriving early for, which masters actually welcome questions, and which tavern cooks don't reuse the same broth until it turns philosophical. Your Latin is sharp now, at least in that I won't embarrass myself mid-argument way, and you've stopped worrying whether your robes make you look like a damp funeral procession. You're surviving. And more than that, strangely, stubbornly, you're thriving. Today is a perfect snapshot of your life now. A typical day in the life of a medieval university student. And by typical, of course, we mean equal parts sacred, ridiculous, and physically painful. It begins naturally with bells. Always bells. You've grown to hate their optimism. The cold wakes you even before the ringing does. Your breath fogs in the air, your fingers ache before you've moved, and the straw beneath your blanket feels like someone tried to sleep on a bale of spears. You light a stub of candle, pull your robe over yesterday's tunic, and splash a handful of frigid water on your face. No soap, no mirror. Just the grim knowledge that you've got to be in your seat before the master begins lecturing, or risk being locked out and branded a sluggard. Breakfast is a joke. A chunk of yesterday's bread, vaguely softened in water, maybe a smear of something resembling cheese. You chew mechanically while scribbling a few notes for the day's disputation. You're arguing a point in moral philosophy. Something about whether intention or outcome defines a virtuous act. You've prepared your arguments. Mostly, you'll probably wing the rest. The streets are damp and full of early smoke. Bakers carry trays of half-formed loaves past you. Apprentices shout at dogs, and the local beggar near the church door nods as you pass. He knows your face by now, knows you're not likely to give coin, but might offer part of your crust if you've eaten half first. You arrive just in time for lecture, canon law this morning. The master begins not with a greeting, but with a question. When is excommunication valid, and who may declare it? He stares at the class like he's already disappointed in you. He launches into a reading from Gratian's Decretum, monotone and merciless, pausing only to hiss at anyone not paying attention. Your bench is cold. Your ink freezes between sentences. But somehow, you're focused. You know this material. You've studied it by candlelight, whispered it while pacing the alley behind your lodging. You even wrote a sarcastic song about it once, though it only rhymed in Latin, and barely made sense. After lecture, there's disputation. You stand on a raised platform in the centre of a half-circle of students, palms sweating, voice shaking just enough to betray you. You present your thesis. Virtue lies in the will, not the consequence. Then the attacks come. Objections. Counterexamples. One student brings up the case of a monk who accidentally saves a man while trying to harm him. Another cites Augustine. You counter with Aquinas, then trip over a minor point and nearly ruin your argument. But you recover. You push through. You use distingo like a dagger and somehow survive. Not a triumph, but a solid showing. Here's your historical fact. A typical day for a medieval university student involved long hours of lecture, often 4 to 6 hours straight, followed by disputations or private study. Meals were brief and sparse. Free time, when it existed, was often spent copying texts, writing letters, or attending religious services. The idea of student life being leisurely or relaxed is a modern invention. In the 13th century, if you weren't studying, You were probably falling behind. After disputation, you head to the courtyard with a group of fellow students, all of you half frozen and half starved. You trade commentary on the morning's lecture. Someone tries to explain why the master's phrasing of licit but not expedient ruined their entire understanding of ecclesiastical punishment. Another offers a joke about Aristotle falling in love with a syllogism. You laugh, even though it's terrible. Everything's funnier when you haven't eaten. Lunch is stew, thin, mostly onion. You eat it at a long table in the refectory, surrounded by the sound of spoons scraping bowls and Latin murmurs. Someone reads from a devotional text at the far end of the room, a rule of the college, so even while eating you're technically learning. You tune out most of it and focus on the vague taste of lentil and the way your stomach sighs like it's heard a rumour of nutrition. Afternoon study follows. You claim a spot in the scriptorium, unfurl your notes, and set about the slow, deliberate act of making sense of the morning's torrent. Your fingers cramp, your ink smudges, but you manage 3 pages of legible, if slightly chaotic, glosses. Then, when your eyes feel like they might revolt, you close your books and go for a walk. Here's a quirky fact. Students often took walks to memorize texts, pacing back and forth while chanting verses under their breath. The repetitive movement helped imprint the words. Some even had preferred walking paths, routes known to be quiet or lucky for learning. You've adopted this habit without even realizing. There's a stretch of wall near the river where you always go to recite. It smells like moss and occasionally dead fish, but no one bothers you there. Evening arrives, and with it, vespers. The chapel is lit with candles, the chant low and hypnotic. You mouth the Latin psalms, your voice blending into the drone. It's a ritual that grounds you, even if you're too tired to feel particularly holy. Afterward, you meet with a small group in the tavern for a study circle that quickly devolves into arguments and laughter. You trade passages from texts, invent mnemonic songs, even take turns translating the bawdier parts of Ovid just to see who blushes first. Someone brings out a stolen bottle of wine. You drink just enough to forget your sore knees and the ink stain on your cheek. You return to your room late, teeth chattering, feet aching. You curl under your cloak on the straw mat, notes beside you, candle nearly burned out. Here's the scholarly debate. Was the daily life of a medieval student structured to build discipline, or simply to wear them down? Some argue the rigour prepared scholars for the mental demands of religious or legal service. Others say it was a system designed by those who had long forgotten what it meant to be young, to be curious, to want time to just think. You don't know who's right. You only know that today you studied, you spoke, you listened, you laughed, and tomorrow you'll do it all again. The storm rolls in just before dawn. You're woken not by bells this time, but by the sudden silence before the thunder cracks. A pause so complete it feels like the world has forgotten to breathe. Then it hits. Rain, cold and relentless, drumming on the roof like angry fingers, wind howling through the wooden shutters, sneaking in with that unmistakable scent of wet stone and old smoke. You lie there a moment, wrapped in your damp robe, blinking at the ceiling as water drips from a crack you've been meaning to patch. It's going to be a long day. Classes are suspended, not officially, but practically. When the streets turn into miniature rivers and half the staircases disappear under mud, no one expects students to wade across the city for a lesson in speculative theology. Besides, your master's not a fan of speaking over thunder. God gets the last word, he once said, with that little smile that somehow makes everything sound like both a joke and a warning. So you have the rarest thing in your student life: unstructured time, a blank day, a pause. You should study. There are notes to copy, arguments to refine, books to beg, borrow or steal, ethically of course. But instead you sit by the small window, watching the rain slice through the air like silver threads unravelling the world. Down in the street, a cart tips, and apples spill into a flooded gutter. A boy chases them, barefoot and laughing. Somewhere a dog howls, maybe from joy, maybe from terror. It's hard to tell. You don't know it yet, but these are the days that will settle in your memory more deeply than any lecture. Days where the university isn't defined by parchment or punishment, but by the stillness between. Days when you remember you're not just a student, but a person too. Here's Your historical fact: inclement weather often disrupted university life. Without paved streets or reliable infrastructure, storms could flood lecture halls, collapse roofs, and make travel across town genuinely dangerous. In cities like Bologna and Paris, students were known to band together during harsh winters or heavy rains, pooling resources and keeping fires burning in common areas. Sometimes, bad weather even delayed entire academic terms, though not often enough, if you ask any student who's ever fallen asleep in class with frozen fingers. You spend the morning sorting through your notes, carefully, because some of the older pages are warping from the damp. Margins are full of tiny sketches, geometric patterns, faces, the occasional badly drawn bird. There's even a short poem in one corner you don't remember writing. It's terrible. You keep it anyway. At midday, when the rain finally lightens, you wander into the corridor where a group of students has gathered, slumped against the wall like bored statues. Someone's trying to organise an impromptu disputation. Another is carving something rude into a wooden beam with his belt buckle. You sit beside a friend, quiet, thoughtful, prone to quoting Seneca in moments where Seneca really has no business being quoted. He says, "You ever think about what comes next?" You raise an eyebrow. "Next, like, after lunch?" "No," he says. "After this. The university, the robes, the lectures." You've thought about it, of course. Everyone has. But it's one of those topics that hovers in the air like smoke, visible, but better left alone. Most students go on to take holy orders, especially those from poorer families. It's the clearest path, the most secure. Some enter the church as preachers, others as administrators, a few as scholars if they can charm the right bishop. Law students become notaries or advocates, often ending up as the right-hand men of powerful lords or popes, and the rest, they scatter. Some teach, some vanish into monastic libraries. A few you suspect go mad from too much logic and too little wine. Here's a quirky fact. Some medieval students spent so long studying without ever graduating that they became permanent fixtures of the university, jokingly referred to as eternal bachelors. They haunted lecture halls well into middle age, offering unsolicited advice to terrified newcomers and arguing with masters like they were old drinking buddies. One university even had a rule banning students over the age of 40 from attending first-year disputations on the grounds that they intimidated the actual novices. Your friend stares at the leaking ceiling and says, "I thought by now I'd know what I'm meant for." You want to offer something comforting, something wise. Instead you say, "At least we know we're not meant to be roofers." He laughs, and for a moment, that's enough. The afternoon drips by. You read a few pages from a borrowed text, Averroes on the Soul, translated clumsily, but enough to stir something in your mind. You jot notes in the margin, then underline a line that feels both profound and slightly ominous. The intellect is eternal, the person is not. You stare at it for a while. Then, because you can't help it, you draw a small skull next to it and write, Memento Mori. Here's the scholarly debate. Did the medieval university offer a path to enlightenment, or simply a ladder to power? Some historians argue that it was a sacred institution, a beacon of learning that preserved classical knowledge and sharpened minds in service of truth. Others see it as an early bureaucracy, designed to manufacture obedient clergy and competent bureaucrats. And somewhere in the middle is the idea that it was both, a place where minds expanded and were shaped to fit. Evening settles over the city like a shawl. The storm fades into memory, leaving behind puddles that mirror the lantern light. You walk through the narrow lanes, boots squelching, the smell of rain and earth in your nose. Students pass by, robes lifted to avoid the mud. One of them hums a hymn under his breath. Another is shouting something about Plato and puddles. Back in your room, you light a candle with the last dry match you have. You sit at your desk, open your notebook, and do something strange. You write a letter to yourself, not for delivery, not for anyone else, just a message for the future. You don't say much, just a few lines about today, the storm, the quiet, the way the rain made the world feel wider, and then you fold it, slip it between 2 pages of a borrowed book, and close it without marking the place. You blow out the candle, the room sighs into darkness. You'll wake up tomorrow to bells, cold, hunger and obligation, but tonight, just for now, you are still. There are few things more terrifying in your academic life than an unexpected knock on the door at dawn. It's the kind of sound that snatches you straight out of half sleep and plants every imaginable disaster in your brain all at once. Someone's dead, the bishop's summoned you, or worse, your tutor wants to discuss your last disputation. The knock repeats, firmer now, and you scramble out of your scratchy blanket, pulling your robe around your shoulders like it's going to protect you from divine judgment. But when you open the door, blinking at the early light, it's just a boy, barefoot, breath puffing in the cold air, holding a folded parchment with a broken wax seal and a very smug expression. "For you," he says, before vanishing back into the fog like some medieval paper ghost. The letter is an invitation from your old master in Paris. He's passing through Bologna for a few days on some scholarly errand, though from the way he's worded it, you suspect it might involve disputing a rival and then gloating about it. He wants to meet. "Catch up," he writes. And though the tone is formal, there's an undercurrent of something else, a tug at shared history, a reminder that he knew you when you barely understood the difference between substance and accident. You weren't expecting to feel so much. Anxiety mostly. Gratitude too, maybe. A little dread. That man once roasted you in front of 40 students for misquoting Boethius, and yet here you are, already planning what to wear like it matters. You spend the day in a daze, brushing off questions from classmates with half answers and vague shrugs. You go through your notes compulsively, in case he asks what you've been studying. You clean your shoes, twice. You iron your robe using a brick wrapped in a cloth, which works better than you'd think. By the time you arrive at the tavern where he's staying, your stomach is tying itself into theological knots. The place is warm, dimly lit and full of quiet clatter. Coin on wood, spoon against bowl, fire crackling like it's trying to participate in the conversation. You spot him at a corner table, hunched over a wine jug, still somehow managing to look both annoyed and superior even while alone. He looks up as you approach and gives a small nod. "Ah," he says, "you haven't fled the faith yet." Encouraging. You sit. He pours wine. No greetings, no small talk, just straight into it. Here's your historical fact. Relationships between medieval students and their masters were often deep, complex, and far more personal than modern ones. A master was teacher, mentor, critic, and sometimes a kind of surrogate parent, especially for students who'd left home young. Loyalty could last a lifetime, even across schools and cities. Some students followed their masters across Europe. Others wrote letters years after graduating, seeking advice or forgiveness. He asks about your studies. You answer carefully, mentioning the texts you've read, the disputations you've joined, the particular fondness you've developed for moral philosophy. He raises an eyebrow. You always were too soft for logic. Then, sipping his wine, he adds, "But better that than another half-wit theologian arguing whether angels get tired." You laugh nervously. He doesn't. Then, something shifts. He begins to ask real questions. Not tests, not traps, but genuine curiosity. What do you make of the tension between reason and revelation? How do you interpret the concept of gratia infusa, infused grace, in the writings of Bernard? Do you think a man can truly change his will, or does he simply redirect his desire? You answer, stumble, rephrase, push back once or twice, and to your shock, he listens. At one point, you disagree entirely with his reading of a passage from the sentences, and instead of lecturing you, he tilts his head and says, "Interesting." You're so startled you forget your next point. Here's a quirky fact. In some cases, students wrote entire books as responses to their masters, extended rebuttals, respectful, critiques, or reinterpretations of disputed topics. These weren't considered insults, but part of an intellectual tradition. One student in the 14th century even titled his treatise Contra Magistrum Meum, or Against My Master, which today would probably get you disinvited from academic dinners forever. The conversation flows, hours pass, the jug empties. At some point he tells a story about a disastrous sermon he once gave in front of a bishop who fell asleep mid-sentence. You laugh so hard you spill wine on your notes. He doesn't even scold you. Then the tone shifts again, quieter now, reflective. He tells you that he's proud. Not in those exact words, of course. He says, "You've become tolerable." But in his voice, there's something warmer than you've ever heard from him. He leans back, looking older than you remembered, and says, You think it's about knowing more. It's not. It's about learning how to know, how to listen, how to stop speaking sometimes. You nod, unsure whether he's talking about you or himself. Here's the scholarly debate. Were medieval masters rigid gatekeepers of knowledge, or humble guides through the labyrinth of learning? Some scholars paint them as narrow-minded defenders of orthodoxy, more interested in repetition than exploration. Others argue that, within the constraints of doctrine, many were deeply creative thinkers who challenged students to probe, argue, and reformulate the world through structured thought. The truth? Probably both, and probably neither. When the night ends, he claps a hand on your shoulder and says, "Keep reading, and stop quoting Lombard like he's scripture. He's not that clever." Then he's gone, off to lecture or argue or charm some poor monastery into funding his next manuscript. You step out into the cold air, heart strangely full. He didn't change your life tonight. He didn't give you a roadmap or answer the cosmic questions, but he reminded you why you started this path. Not for the robes or the status or even the theology, but because somewhere, buried under the rules and hunger and parchment, there's joy in the search. You walk home under stars you haven't looked at in weeks, whispering bits of Latin you half remember and letting yourself believe, for just this moment, that you're exactly where you're meant to be. A strange quiet has fallen over the university. Not the good kind, the kind that wraps around you like a warm blanket and lets your thoughts drift gently through Aristotle and Augustine, but a tight, tense kind of silence, like the air before a fight. The corridors feel longer, the glances sharper, and you start to notice students muttering in smaller groups, eyes darting toward doorways like something might burst through them at any moment. And then, finally, the news breaks, passed from mouth to mouth like a hot coal. A new bishop has been appointed to Bologna, and he's not a fan of students. Specifically, not. A fan of students who question too much, drink too much, or, heaven forbid, criticise the church in any way, shape, or even metaphor. His name is Bishop Trucido, and the whispers about him suggest he once condemned a young friar for sneezing during a sermon. Maybe not true, but the tone of the tale tells you what matters. People are nervous, and when people are nervous, things happen. It starts slowly, an announcement that all public lectures must now begin with a prayer approved by the bishop. Then a proclamation that any master found discussing uncertified theological interpretations will be investigated. That one stings, because uncertified is vague enough to mean anything, and that's when the real fear sets in. You remember what happened to that student back in Paris, the one who questioned transubstantiation. You remember his empty seat, the silence afterward, and suddenly everyone is watching their words again. Disputations become tame. No one challenges a master's reading anymore. No one pushes the boundaries. Even the tavern talk gets quieter. Latin curses are replaced by carefully phrased hypotheticals. "If one were to say" becomes the new favourite sentence starter. You try to focus on your studies, but the tension is like static in your brain. You read Aquinas and find yourself underlining only the safest, most widely accepted passages. You start censoring your own margin notes just in case, and you're not alone. Students you once laughed with now speak in half sentences. The library feels like a church. The air smells like ink and fear. Here's your historical fact. Medieval universities existed in a constant push and pull with ecclesiastical authority. While the church was essential to their existence, providing legitimacy, structure, and protection, it also frequently sought to rein in what it viewed as dangerous intellectual freedom. Bishops and inquisitors could and did intervene when teachings appeared to veer too far from orthodoxy. In some cases, entire faculties were investigated. In others, universities went on strike or relocated to escape ecclesiastical interference. And that's where the whispers start to shift. First, it's just frustration, then resentment, then an idea that spreads like smoke under a door. What if we left? Not individually, collectively, a student strike. At first it sounds ridiculous. Who would dare? But the more the restrictions tighten, the more students start entertaining it seriously. And then one morning, a master arrives to an empty hall. No students. Not one. The rumour spreads fast. Dozens of students have walked out, gathering in the town square with placards. Placards in Latin, no less, accusing the bishop of choking the life out of scholarship. It's small and chaotic and beautiful in its way. A Latin protest that smells like wet parchment and teenage rebellion. You join them before you can talk yourself out of it. You stand there in the drizzle, holding a sign you helped write, chanting phrases half from Cicero and half from someone's bad drinking song turned political slogan. It's absurd, it's dangerous, it's exhilarating. Here's a quirky fact. Some of the earliest university strikes in history happened exactly like this. Students at Oxford in 1209 fled to Cambridge after a violent conflict with townspeople and the intervention of the Crown. Paris saw multiple strikes across the 13th century, including one that lasted for 2 full years. These weren't just walkouts, they were organised acts of defiance, sometimes involving hundreds of students and masters relocating en masse to avoid oppressive oversight. But standing in that square, soaked and shouting, you're not thinking about historical precedent. You're thinking about your master's voice, low and amused, telling you once, "A good argument always carries risk." Risk is here now, standing next to you in the form of an armed guard watching the protest with narrowed eyes. You glance at your fellow students. Some are grinning, drunk on the idea of resistance. Others look like they might bolt at any moment. You feel your heart pounding in your ears. The bishop doesn't come out, of course not. But a decree arrives by courier that evening. Students involved in the protest may be suspended from attending lectures pending further inquiry. The next morning, 3 of your friends are told not to return to class. No formal charges, no hearings, just gone. And that's when the fear comes back, this time stronger. You stop sleeping well. You start watching what you say again, even with friends. You wonder quietly whether leaving Paris was trading one kind of danger for another. Here's the scholarly debate. Were these student rebellions acts of idealism or self-preservation? Some historians argue that students were standing up for academic freedom in the face of oppression. Others suggest it was more about power, maintaining autonomy over fees, housing and governance. Both are probably true. Students in the medieval university world were deeply aware of their collective power. They were loud, messy, and occasionally reckless, but they knew that without them, the university was nothing more than a pile of dusty books and overpaid priests. You return to your studies the next week, quietly. The protest fizzles out, not with a bang but a silent shrug. Too many are scared, too few want to risk exile, and in the end the lectures resume, the prayers grow longer, and the masters look a little more tired. You write in your notes that night, "Truth whispers when fear shouts," then you hide the page. Because it's not just about what you believe, it's about knowing when and where and how to say it. By now, the seasons have begun to shift again. Subtly at first. The cold doesn't bite quite so sharply when you wake. The trees that line the dusty paths outside the city are shedding their brittle husks of winter, stretching towards sun that finally lingers. You notice things in the light that you didn't before. Cracks in the stone walls, faces in the crowd you've never really seen. How the colour of someone's robe looks different in sunlight than by candle. But the real marker of time passing isn't the weather, it's how the city feels. Something softening. After the weeks of tension, after the bishop's crackdown and the student protests that swelled and then slumped, there's a quiet relief in the air. Not victory, not resolution, just a kind of exhausted settling. No more decrees have come down, no more students have disappeared. Your master has resumed his usual rhythm, though you catch him glancing at the door more than he used to, as if still waiting for a final blow that never lands. You too are adjusting. You no longer panic at every knock. You no longer flinch at your own ideas. You've learned something, not about theology or law or logic, but about survival, about the space between fear and freedom. And today, as you sit under a pale blue sky in the dusty courtyard of your college, you begin something you've been putting off for far too long. Your commentary is not mandatory exactly. No one's holding a knife to your neck. But for many students, writing a commentarium, your own thoughts, your own responses to an authoritative text, is the moment where you stop repeating others and start speaking in your own voice. It's terrifying and thrilling. You choose a passage from the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle, of course. You've always found him frustrating, full of sentences that seem brilliant until you try to explain them to someone else. You pick the part on friendship, specifically the section where he claims true friendship can only exist between virtuous equals. It's probably not the most original choice, but it feels real. You've lived enough by now to know the difference between a drinking companion and someone who stays up late with you trying to untangle the idea of the good. You stare at the blank page. The ink dries at the tip of your quill before you even write the first word. Here's your historical fact. Medieval students often wrote commentaries as a way of engaging with authoritative texts. These could range from simple glosses, short explanations in the margins, to full-scale treatises arguing with or expanding on the original work. In many cases, these commentaries were read aloud, debated, or even compiled into anthologies for other students to read. It was one of the few ways students could begin to carve out a scholarly identity. You start writing. Slowly. Your Latin is serviceable now, if still a bit clunky. You begin with a respectful nod to Aristotle, then ease into your own thoughts, carefully distinguishing what he says from what you believe. You use words like forsitan, perhaps, and videtur, it seems, as padding, as soft cushions around harder claims. It's the academic version of "don't yell at me," but you write late into the evening. By the time you stop, your candle has burned to a stump and your fingers are sore, but you've filled 2 full pages, your words, your thoughts, your voice. It feels like stepping into a room you've always seen through a keyhole. The next day you bring it to your master. You don't expect him to read it immediately, but he does, right there. You sit, awkward, watching his eyes move left to right. He grunts once, then again. He reaches for a second quill and makes 2 corrections in the margin. Your Latin betrayed you in the 3rd paragraph, and then, to your complete shock, he says, "Well reasoned." Just that. Then he hands it back. You float for the rest of the day. Here's a quirky fact. Students who produced exceptional commentaries sometimes passed them along to younger students as a kind of unofficial inheritance. In one university, there was a handwritten commentary on Peter Lombard's sentences that had been passed through at least 5 generations of students, each adding their own notes in different coloured inks. By the end, it looked like a philosophical rainbow full of minor disagreements, inside jokes, and one doodle of a cow labelled Aquinas' other beast. You begin writing more, not always for others, not even always to finish, but just to think. You scribble in margins, you fill scraps of parchment. Sometimes you just write questions, sometimes answers, sometimes you lose the difference between the two and just let the words carry you. Here's the scholarly debate. Was student commentary in the Middle Ages truly original scholarship, or merely parroting dressed up as innovation? Some historians argue that students were still tightly bound by authority, unable to challenge the core ideas of the text they studied. Others say that within those boundaries, students found room to push, reshape, and reinterpret in ways that quietly laid the groundwork for future intellectual revolutions. Either way, commentary was where ideas started to shift, where students stopped consuming and began creating. You start to see it in others too. A friend shares a poem he's written in Latin hexameter, all about the soul's desire to escape bodily cravings. It's clumsy and brilliant. Another has composed a mini treatise on laughter, inspired by a tavern brawl that somehow ended in a debate on whether joy was a sin. It's nonsense, and possibly genius. This is the strange, wonderful secret of the medieval university. For all its formality, all its rules and rituals, it's built on the raw, chaotic drive of people trying to figure out the world with nothing but ink and the bones of ancient texts. You begin to carry a little roll of parchment in your robe, just in case. Because sometimes, in the middle of a lecture, or during vespers, or while eating watery soup, a thought strikes you. A sentence, an image, a question, and you write it down. The world becomes something. You're not just surviving, but participating in. You're still just a student, yes, but now you're a student with a voice. You didn't think it would come so soon, the announcement, the date, the growing certainty of it, but now it's real. Your final public disputation is just 2 weeks away. It hovers on the calendar like an execution. Not that you're being dramatic. Okay, maybe a little, but this is the culmination of years of lectures, parchment, ink-stained fingers, half-digested bread crusts, and the countless nights your candle guttered long past midnight while you whispered Aristotle like a prayer. Now it all leads here. Determinatio Publica, your formal disputation before masters, fellow students, and any townspeople with enough curiosity or spare time to watch a nervous scholar sweat through his robes. It's not an exam in the modern sense. No written test, no neat scores. It's a performance, an ordeal. You'll present a thesis, a position on some slippery slice of logic or theology, and then stand there as the academic wolves take turns trying to tear it apart. All in Latin, of course, all from memory. If you're lucky, they'll merely attack your reasoning. If you're unlucky, well, there's always law school. You've chosen your thesis carefully. Utrum voluntas libera possit esse sine gratia divina. Whether free will can exist apart from divine grace. A classic. Safe enough to avoid suspicion of heresy, but still dangerous if you say the wrong thing. Augustine looms large here. Aquinas is essential. But you're threading a needle. Too much autonomy and you flirt with Pelagianism. Too little, and you risk reducing humans to puppets. And you? You're aiming for that delicate, maddening middle ground. Because like most things you've learned in this place, the truth doesn't live in absolutes. The moment you post your thesis outside the college chapel, a thin parchment nailed to the weather-stained bulletin board, you feel a shift in the air. A few students read it immediately, murmuring. One frowns, another nods. A third makes a crude joke in Latin and walks off laughing. You smile thinly, suddenly aware that every word you've written is about to be tested in front of people who really want to see what you're made of. Here's your historical fact. Public disputations were a standard part of the medieval university system, especially as a requirement for achieving degrees like Bachelor or Master of Arts. These events were often formal, ritualized affairs, attended by faculty, students, and sometimes members of the local clergy or even nobility. They served not only as an academic assessment, but also as public proof of a student's rhetorical skill and theological or philosophical soundness. In some universities, disputations could last several hours, and if particularly contentious, even days. You prepare obsessively. Days blur together. You read and reread Augustine's Confessions, Thomas's Summa, Peter Lombard's sentences, even a few controversial glosses you probably shouldn't quote aloud. You write out your responses to likely objections, then you write responses to those responses. You pace the courtyard, muttering counter-arguments under your breath until someone asks if you're reciting a spell. You sleep less, eat less, think more. And then, the night before, your friends gather, not for a study session, not for advice, but for a kind of ritual. They bring bread, cheese, wine, and nervous laughter. One produces a makeshift laurel crown made of twisted parchment and dead ivy. For tomorrow, he says, in case you survive. Another hands you a fake diploma, comically oversized, declaring you most likely to be condemned by the bishop. You laugh, you drink, and for a little while, you forget to be afraid. Here's a quirky fact. In some medieval universities, students created elaborate traditions around final disputations. Friends would compose mock congratulatory poems, organise processions, or host satirical pre-celebrations the night before. These rituals helped ease the anxiety and reinforce the communal nature of study. After all, no one made it to a disputation alone. Not really. You made it through because others pushed, challenged, and occasionally mocked you into becoming sharper. The next morning, you wake before the bells. Your robe is as clean as it's going to get. Your notes, useless now since everything must be delivered from memory, sit untouched on the desk. The city outside is quiet, too early for even the bakers. You close your eyes and recite your opening lines in your head one last time. Then you step out into the cold and walk to meet your future. The hall is already filling when you arrive. The master presiding over your disputation nods to you without smiling. A small group of students gathers near the back, pretending to be casual while clearly taking bets on whether you'll choke. You stand beside the wooden platform, heart hammering against your ribs like a warning. Then your name is called. You ascend the steps. You take your place. And you begin. Here's the scholarly debate. Were public disputations a genuine reflection of student mastery, or just academic theatre? Some believe these events were essential training, forging skilled thinkers under pressure. Others see them as more performative, rewarding memorization and confidence over deeper understanding. But in either case, they were moments, pivotal, public, and defining. You weren't just displaying what you knew, you were proving who you were. Your voice shakes at first, your mouth is dry, but the words come, the arguments flow. You cite Augustine with care, Aquinas with reverence, and even slip in a clever analogy involving Noah's Ark that earns a surprised grunt from one of the masters. Then come the objections, rapid fire. One asks if your thesis implies heresy, another demands clarification on a point, about liberum arbitrium. A third accuses your use of grace as overly mechanical. You respond. Not perfectly, but earnestly. You dodge where you must. You concede strategically. You don't win every moment, but you stand your ground. You engage, and when it ends, when the last objection is answered and the final blessing is given, there's a pause. Then polite applause, and from the master, a nod. You step down, dizzy. One friend shouts, "You didn't die!" Another hands you the laurel crown. This time you wear it proudly. Even if it smells a little like goat parchment, you don't feel triumphant. You feel spent, but also awake. Because today, you weren't just a student. You were a thinker. You were heard. The days after your disputation move differently. Time, once tight and measured in lectures and bells, suddenly stretches out like softened wax. You find yourself waking before dawn not from anxiety, but habit, lying there, half draped in your robe, staring at the cracked ceiling with no immediate pressure to rehearse a response to whether virtue is in the will or in the act. For the first time in years, your brain isn't sprinting ahead, it's walking, slowly, pausing to smell things. It's disorienting. You keep expecting someone to knock on your door with a scroll announcing that your performance was invalid, or that the bishop changed the rules again, or that a minor misquote of Augustine has condemned you to retake your entire course of study. But no one comes. No one drags you away. And so, very quietly, it becomes real. You've finished. Not everything. Not forever. But this chapter, the long grind of daily lectures, parchment scrawls, ink-stained palms, and the smell of mouldy benches, is over. You're no longer just a student. You're something else now. Not yet a master. Not a priest or lawyer or scholar with a cushioned post and your own lectern. But you've crossed a line, and it shows in the way people look at you, in the way younger students ask your opinion, in the way your name suddenly carries weight, even if it's just as the one who handled the bishop's question without flinching. There's no graduation ceremony, no cap thrown into the air, no scroll with fancy lettering, and an official wax seal declaring you officially enlightened. TM. But a few nights after the disputation, your master invites you to dinner. Not in the refectory, not in a tavern, in his private quarters. That's a first. You arrive nervous, naturally. But he greets you with a warmth that still surprises you. A firm handshake, a rare smile, even wine that doesn't taste like floor polish. The room smells of parchment and beeswax and faintly, comfortingly of pipe smoke. Books crowd every surface, scrolls shoved into corners like overgrown weeds. You think, this is what a life of learning looks like. He asks about your plans. You hesitate. You have plans. Sort of. Maybe teaching. Maybe law. Maybe cloistered life, surrounded by books and Gregorian chants. You haven't quite decided whether you want to be someone who speaks or someone who listens. Your master pours more wine and says, "You should leave." You blink. Leave? Bologna, the university, this place. For a time, at least. He sees your confusion and adds, "You've outgrown the cage. Even the golden ones are cages." And just like that, the question of what next shifts from a cloud to a road. Here's your historical fact. Many students, upon completing their disputation, or earning their licentia docendi, were expected to leave their university and pursue further study, teaching or service elsewhere. The mobility of medieval scholars was extraordinary. They travelled between cities, countries, even kingdoms, chasing knowledge, patronage, or a stable teaching post. Entire careers were shaped by letters of recommendation, informal networks, and whether a distant monastery needed someone to organise its chaotic library. You begin to pack, not in a dramatic, flurry of parchment kind of way, just a little at a time. You return the books you borrowed, reluctantly. You give your remaining ink and scrap parchment to a younger student who reminds you of yourself 3 years ago. Wide-eyed, hungry, underdressed. You don't tell him that he'll probably consider quitting at least twice a week. He'll figure that out. You walk the streets slower now. Take longer at the chapel. Visit old lecture halls not to learn, but to remember. You find the bench where you first fell asleep during a sermon. The corridor where you accidentally insulted your logic tutor in clumsy Latin. The tavern where someone read you bad poetry and you clapped anyway. Here's a quirky fact. Some students left little marks on their universities before they departed. Notes scratched into walls, marginalia in forgotten books, poems hidden between layers of binding. One student reportedly nailed his disputation thesis to the dormitory door with a poem beneath that read, "He who challenges truth must sleep in cold rooms." No one knows who he was, but the door is still there. You think about doing something similar, maybe not carving your name into the walls, though the temptation is strong, but something small. A note, perhaps, tucked into a forgotten alcove of the library. A line of Latin that only someone with too much time and curiosity will find. You write, "In tenebris querimus lucem. In darkness we seek the light." You fold it. You hide it. And then you say your goodbyes. Here's the scholarly debate. Did the medieval university truly prepare students for the world, or only for more university? Some argue that the knowledge gained, logic, rhetoric, theology, had limited practical application outside academia. Others contend that it formed the foundation for law, governance, and the entire clerical apparatus of the medieval world. But maybe the point wasn't just knowledge. Maybe it was endurance, patience, the ability to live with questions. Your master gives you a final gift before you leave, a small book of blank parchment, bound in leather, rough-edged and worn. No words, just potential. He says, "You've spent years copying and repeating. Now fill this one with what's yours." You don't know where the road will take you. Maybe to a bishop's court, maybe to a monastery, maybe to another university, where you'll sit on the other side of the lectern and frown at students who misquote Augustine. But wherever you go, you'll carry this with you. The rhythms of bells, the smell of ink, the quiet thrill of an argument well made. You've lived the life of a medieval student, and somehow you survived. You leave the university before sunrise, walking through the city streets one last time with your belongings tied up in a rough cloth, your robe swishing softly against the stones. The city isn't awake yet, but the baker's fire is already crackling. The bells haven't begun, and the air is still heavy with the damp scent of early morning. Ashes, cold bread, horses asleep in their stalls. It feels like the right moment to go. You glance over your shoulder as the city fades behind you. The rooftops of Bologna stretch upward like worn teeth. Somewhere back there is your old room with its cracked ceiling, its one wobbly chair, and that single wooden beam you once stared at while memorizing arguments about divine justice. Somewhere there's a student who just arrived, tugging nervously at a too big robe, terrified of everything. You want to tell him it'll be all right. Not perfect, not easy, but worth it. Your boots crunch over the hard dirt road. There's no parade, no ceremony, no triumphant music swelling as you step into your new life. Just your steps, just the sky overhead, beginning to tint with colour, and the quiet flutter of your thoughts. You wonder where the road will take you. Another city, another school, maybe a monastery by the sea, maybe a post writing letters for a noble who thinks too highly of his Latin. Maybe you'll teach, maybe you won't. But what you do know, what you've earned, is the right to wonder, the right to question. In your satchel, the little blank book your master gave you waits, still untouched. It rustles softly as you walk, like it knows the words are coming. One day, you'll fill it. Not today. Maybe not even this month, but eventually. Because you've learned how to think, how to listen, how to speak. Somewhere along the line, amid all the rules and rituals and endless disputations, you became a person who could stand in front of a room full of strangers and say, "Here is what I believe, and here's why." That doesn't leave you. So, as the sun rises and your long road opens ahead, remember, you carry the echoes of every master's voice, every late-night debate, every piece of chalk dust and scrap of parchment. You are part of something ancient, strange, and quietly revolutionary, and now you're free to make of it what you will.